The way this mechanism has been set up in India has sort of relied on what are called command and control instruments, right? So basically there is a standard. You're meant to be under that standard. Somebody comes and measures this from time to time. If you're above that standard, it is a criminal offense. And therefore, there's going to be like a lawsuit filed against you. You could land up in jail and sort of pay a fine of some kind. In practice, the legal system in India is sort of backed up. Most cases take years and years and years. The actual compliance against these standards is quite poor. The pollution control boards are understaffed. There is no real mechanism by which they can go after these many industries that are flouting the law. As a result, for the most part, the regulatory regime just sort of fails. So if a particular industry is found to be non-compliant, there is sort of a gentle slap on the wrist. There is some kind of polite correspondence where the regulator writes to the industry and sort of asks them to sort of explain themselves and sort of ends with that. There is very little action taken.
Hey listeners, Rob Wiblin here, Head of Research at 80,000 Hours. Air pollution kills and harms people far more than we typically appreciate, in rich and poor countries alike. It probably kills 10 times as many people as malaria. Tuberculosis is the single communicable disease that kills the most people each year, and air pollution maybe kills 4 times as many people as that. And of course, much of the harm isn't just about dying. It's about feeling like rubbish, brain fog, and stunted human potential while we are all still alive. So I was really excited to get to talk to Santosh Harish of Open Philanthropy, who's taken on the challenge of using philanthropy to reduce the harm being done by air pollution in India, something that almost nobody else in the world is even attempting to do. We talk about how bad air pollution is for our health and life expectancy, the different kinds of harm that particulate pollution causes, and how strong the evidence is that it's damaging our brain function, whether it was a mistake to switch our attention so much away from air pollution and towards climate change, whether most listeners to this show should, like me, have an air purifier running in their house right now, where air pollution in India is worst and why that is, and whether it's trending upwards or downwards, where most air pollution is coming from, the policy blunders that led to many sources of air pollution in India effectively just being completely unregulated, why indoor air pollution packs a massive punch, the politics of air pollution in India, how India ended up spending a lot of money on outdoor air purifiers, the challenges faced by foreign philanthropists in India, why Santosh has made the grants that he has so far, and plenty more. Without further ado, I bring you Santosh Harish. Today, I'm speaking with Santosh Harish. Santosh leads Open Philanthropy's grantmaking in South Asian air quality, which he's been doing from his office in India since the start of 2022. Prior to that, he was a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, working with the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment. And before that, he worked as the Associate Director for Research at the India Center of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, and did postdoctoral fellowships with JPAL South Asia and Evidence for Policy Design. Back in his relative youth, he studied a Bachelor in Technology at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, before doing a PhD in Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Santosh.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure.
I hope to talk about where the most air pollution comes from, as well as the cheapest ways to reduce it. But first, give it to us straight. How bad is particulate air pollution?
Well, air pollution is the single largest environmental and occupational risk factor to public health globally. Per the Global Burden of Disease estimates, it accounts for something like 6.67 million deaths a year. This was as of 2019, which, to give context, is about 12% of all deaths globally, right? Not all of this is particulate matter. Particulate matter is the vast majority of this. A small fraction of this is what's called ground level ozone. But yeah, it's pretty bad. So when I started working on air pollution, which is about roughly a decade back, right? Some of these high numbers was sort of hard to sort of come to terms with, right? It almost seems implausibly large intuitively, because you're like, okay, well, it's bad. I mean, it's presumably bad for your lungs or something, but could it really be this bad? So the thing about air pollution which makes it so harmful, and in particular particulate matter air pollution, is that particulate matter is not a single substance, right? It's a cocktail of various things that are in the air that just happen to be finer than 2.5 microns in diameter, which is a tiny fraction of how thick your hair is. And it is composed of a variety of chemical substances, some of which are relatively harmless, some of which are extremely toxic. So it could be stuff like soil dust, which is sort of naturally occurring, or sea salt, which are likely to be, not particularly harmful. And then there is stuff like lead and other heavy metals that are suspended in the air. There are inorganic compounds like sulfates and nitrates, which sort of originate from vehicular emissions, from coal power plant emissions, and so on. So it's a variety of different things. Because these particles are as fine as they are able to enter the lungs, enter the systemic circulation, and then basically these various things that have no business being in our body can sort of travel to different organs and cause a variety of different harms.
Yeah. So I guess, we'd all have the intuition that smog is not going to be great for your health. But I suppose the thing that would be possible to intuitively miss is that there's a whole lot of different chemicals, different kinds of tiny, tiny particles that end up suspended in the air. I guess we talk about PM 2.5. We're going to talk about that a lot. And that's particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns. That is to say, well, I guess I'm not sure how to make it intuitive, but they're small enough that they can cross over into the lungs and into the bloodstream, and then out of the bloodstream into other organs in the body. So they can end up in your brain, end up in your liver, end up in your intestines, or wherever, basically. I guess they can end up in children developing inside a pregnant woman. And so they can do damage to many different parts of your health all at once. And I guess my impression is that people in recent decades have come to think that air pollution is worse than they used to believe, that there's been more research kind of pinning down what effect does air pollution have on many different health issues. And this has caused people to realize that the issue, it's far more systematic, the impacts, than what we'd realized. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's objectively the case that, with each passing year, sometimes it feels like with each passing month or even week, perhaps, there is sort of new literature out there that seems to suggest that air pollution is somehow more harmful on a particular health outcome than we had previously thought, or it actually seems to affect something else that we hadn't even considered earlier, right? For instance, there is a growing literature now on how air pollution affects cognition, right? And thereby affects productivity, affects a bunch of academic outcomes. And this is relatively new literature. This isn't the basis by which, like the global burden of disease, for example, thinks of the harms of air pollution. So these are new things, new impacts of air pollution. And yeah, I think the literature has been growing and been growing at a fairly rapid click, which is quite alarming.
What is perhaps the most outrageous or emotionally grabbing example of air pollution to you? So the thing that I have in mind is something that barely benefits the person who's emitting all of this pollution, but it's causing massive health damage to people in the nearby area.
One thing that comes to mind is sort of municipal waste burning that happens in, sort of many cities in the global south. So basically this is waste that gets collected from people's homes and instead of sort of being transported to a waste management facility or a landfill or something, basically gets burnt at some point because that's like the fastest way to dispose of it, which really sort of points to poor delivery of public services, right? But this is like ubiquitous in, virtually every small or even like medium-sized city. It happens in larger cities too in this part of the world. So I think that's something that sort of truly annoys me because it feels like the kind of thing that ought to be, fairly easily managed, but it happens a lot. It happens because people presumably don't think that it's particularly harmful. I don't think it saves a ton of money for the municipal corporations and other local government that are meant to sort of manage it. So that's one example that comes to mind. I find it particularly annoying simply because it happens so often. It's something that you're able to smell in so many different parts of these cities. Another which seems sort of downright evil to me is a whole bunch of industries that tend to not use the pollution control equipment that they have in their facilities already, right? And just basically like dump the flue gas, as it's called, the gas that gets emitted from the various processes in the industry, without the emission controls in the middle of the night, when it's not obvious. I mean, it can't be detected as easily as it would in the day. And this is basically to, again, like save what I suspect is change, right? In terms of like maintenance and operation costs of this equipment. You have the equipment and there are these standards. And yeah, so that's, I think, downright evil on sort of the part of these industries.
Yeah. Over the last couple of years, I've started getting more and more emotionally incensed by air pollution. I guess, so I studied economics and I read a lot of economists on Twitter and on blogs. And I guess I listen to lots of podcasts that have economists on them. And it feels like over the last 5 years, economists have just been losing their shit more and more about air pollution, just getting more and more frustrated with how much damage seems to be getting done by this, and maybe how surprisingly unseriously it's taken in public policy and just in general, maybe even by voters in some ways. And this has caused me to start, every so often, I live in London, every so often I see a car go down the street that's obviously not in good nick, not in good condition, and it's spewing fumes out the back, and I just get like, these people are like assaulting me as a pedestrian. It's so outrageous what's happening. Like, why don't the police do something? Why doesn't something happen? I don't think this happens so much anymore, but when I first moved to the UK, there were lots of boats along the Thames that were just had I think wood fires or just fuel fires inside the boats. And there were also houses that still had wood fires. I mean, this is obviously a very densely populated area in London. It's crazy that they're just burning fuel, producing this really seriously toxic fumes that are affecting everyone around. Anyway, that's my rant about pollution and my intuitive reaction to it now. I imagine you probably have worse stories from your own experience.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started on like the smoke spewing vehicles on the roads. Again, right? I mean, it's one of those cases where that almost certainly is a symptom of like a highly inefficient vehicle that's sort of still plying on the road, and a newer vehicle would likely save a ton of fuel and also cause much less harm. It seems to be the kind of thing where it's in everybody's interest that this vehicle does not exist on the roads. I'm actually optimistic about this. I do think that the number of these vehicles tends to sort of reduce quite quickly, and that these incentives not to be running them ultimately sort of dawns on whoever owns these vehicles.
Yeah. Okay, let's just clarify something quickly. You're working on South Asia air quality, and I guess South Asia includes what? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, maybe Nepal, Bhutan. But you're mostly focused on India, I guess, because that's where you spend a lot of time and that's where you know the most.
That's right. I am based out of India. I've primarily worked on air pollution in India. So as a grant maker as well, this is my relative comfort zone. It's also the case that air pollution work in India is sort of ahead of the countries in the neighborhood. So there's just a significantly larger number of organizations working on it. The scientific understanding of air pollution is sort of more advanced. So there are obviously more grant making opportunities here as well. By South Asia, we are primarily funding work in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. These four countries are, tend to also feature in sort of the top 10 when it comes to sort of the highest population weighted annual sort of concentrations of PM 2.5 or, sort of the health impacts of it and so on. So this is arguably one of the most polluted parts of the world.
Yeah. And in terms of different pollution types, so there's particulate matter. And so that's the majority of the harm that's been caused is that. I guess there's also ozone. Are there other things that people should have in mind?
Well, there are others like carbon monoxide, for example, which is also an incredibly harmful pollutant. But ground level ozone and PM 2.5 really dominate both in terms of just how harmful they are, but also how widely prevalent they are at levels that are harmful. Yeah.
What are the actual particles? I'd kind of assumed maybe on some level that they were ash, or that they're like the kind of thing that you get if you burned wood and it was going up. So that's got to be part of it. But are there other things as well?
So that's definitely part of it. So there's like, I guess, the finer version of the ash that you see when you burn something, right? But the other constituents of it are things like inorganic compounds like sulfates and nitrates. So sulfur dioxide is one of is principally emitted by the combustion of coal in power plants, in industries which sort of burn coal for a variety of different reasons. Nitrogen oxides are primarily emitted by vehicles burning, diesel or petrol. And these then sort of react with other gases that are in the atmosphere to form sulfates and nitrates, which are particulate matter. The other constituents of it are, there are a bunch of what are called organic compounds, which again get emitted from a variety of different sources. There are trace heavy metals, which are particularly harmful. So this could be lead, for example, being emitted from, for example, the improper smelting or disposal of lead acid batteries and so on. So it's a wide variety of different things, which just happen to be finer than 2.5 microns. And just to sort of, I think, help get a sense of this, a micron or a micrometer is a millionth of a centimeter, and therefore like something like a tenth of the thickness of your hair, if that helps.
So let's when we come back and analyze a little bit more carefully how large is the scale of the damage being done by air pollution. Because I guess on this show we don't just settle for something's really bad. We want to kind of quantify it a little bit more specifically.
Yeah.
So far we've talked about the issue that it causes people to die. So it causes a whole bunch of mortality. Yeah, what are the different ways in which it causes people to die or suffer like directly ill health?
So the evidence is strongest when it comes to a bunch of heart and lung diseases, right? So some of the principal sources of death and illness that can be attributable to air pollution seem to be heart disease, lung cancer, something called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is basically like a chronic lung infection, which, once you have it, it doesn't go away. It cannot be reversed, right? There are lower respiratory infections like pneumonia, strokes, type 2 diabetes. So I think those are some of the big health harms. So the global burden of disease, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with it, but just in case, this is an effort that's sort of anchored by the IHME, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. I think that's right.
That's it, yeah.
So basically, these are sort of periodic, massive scientific enterprises that basically bring together sort of the who's who of public health researchers to try and synthesize evidence on a bunch of different risk factors. So that's what they do for air pollution as well. It tends to be a relatively sort of conservative effort in that they do try and restrict to the sources of illness and death where the evidence is relatively stronger. Although they are pretty transparent that there are significant uncertainties involved in these estimates, right? So till 2017, right? So which is like 2 iterations back, the air pollution harms were basically restricted to just 5 diseases. And the ones that I mentioned earlier, heart disease, lung cancer, COPD, lower respiratory infections and strokes. They have since added type 2 diabetes and one of the more, I guess like an emotional one, which tends to get a lot of attention when these reports get released, is they also included impacts on neonatal deaths in GBD 2019, right? So this is basically infants that die within the first, 27 days after their birth because of the exposure of the fetus within the womb to air pollution. And they estimated something like 500,000 neonatal deaths per year that might be attributable to air pollution, which, again, is like a striking number. So basically, these are infants that, are likely born preterm or possibly with lower birth weight than ideal, and as a result are sort of more vulnerable and therefore there's a higher chance of death within the first month. Yeah, which again I think is a striking and, if true, alarming number.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that air pollution is kind of a major cause or the major cause of around 12% of deaths globally, which is a large fraction
of number.
It's a very, very large number. Is it possible to maybe to try to make it a bit more intuitive? Could we talk about how much let's say that the air in London went to being perfect. Like how much more life expectancy would people in London get? And then if, say, the air pollution in Delhi disappeared completely and they had perfect air, like how many more years of life or years of healthy life might someone expect to enjoy in Delhi?
Yeah. So At the moment, so like going back to the GBD numbers, right? In the UK more generally, and not just London, the sort of the death rates attributable due to air pollution is something of the order of 11 per 100,000. So 11 deaths per 100,000 that can be attributable to. And in India, that number is a factor of 10 higher, right? So something like 98 per 100,000.
Is that per 100,000 people per year?
Per 100,000 people, not 100,000 deaths, 100,000 people.
Got it, yeah.
And the difference between the levels of air pollution is maybe like eightfold on average, maybe slightly less than eightfold. So somewhere between 7 to 8x. It does not scale linearly, right? So one of the things that we have learned in the last few years is that air pollution seems to be harmful at levels that were previously thought to be safe. So much so that the WHO sort of reduced its guidelines for what classifies as clean air from 10 microgram per meter cube of PM 2.5 to something like 5, which is much lower than regulatory standards in any part of the world at the moment. And that's a reflection of research showing that air pollution could actually still be quite harmful at those low levels. The shape of what's called the dose response curve, so basically the dose of your pollution exposure and therefore the response in terms of your health impacts, seems to be curvilinear. So basically at lower levels of pollution, a marginal increase leads to a higher increase in relative risks than at higher levels of air pollution. So basically the relative risks sort of flatten out as the pollution increases. So beyond a point, if I could swear, I mean, you're basically screwed. It doesn't matter if, So that seems to be the shape of the relative risks. But there are multiple sources of non-linearity here when we think about how the air pollution risks manifest, right? So in low-income countries, low and medium-income countries, because there are other sort of sources of public health risk, malnutrition, other sort of pollutants, lower incomes, and therefore lesser ability to sort of access healthcare, things like that, they sort of multiply with each other.
I see.
And therefore, it sort of becomes more harmful. So I don't know if I gave a straight answer to your question.
Well, I think when I was doing background research for this, I saw some map that was attempting to quantify this. We'll stick up a link to it. I remember exactly which source it was. But I think it was suggesting that in the UK, in cities, people were losing 1 to 2 years of life maybe from air pollution in total. Whereas in India, at least in the like more built up areas in the north where the air pollution is worse, I think it was estimating 6, 7, 8 years maybe. I'm not sure. Does that seem plausible, or do you think I've misunderstood?
No. So I think you're referring to the Air Quality Life Index report that the University of Chicago takes out.
Yeah.
It is possible that these numbers are overestimates. So at least compared to like the global burden of disease style synthesis of health impacts, this certainly seems to be on the relatively higher side. An alternative estimate, for example, from the sort of the GBD stable is that Indians might be losing something like 3 years of their life expectancy due to air pollution on average. And obviously that number is higher in North India, but that's almost half of what the AQLI report tends to estimate.
Okay. Yeah, well, these things are hard to estimate. So actually, like only having a twofold range between these different sources.
Yeah, exactly. There are massive uncertainties still. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So 3 to 6 maybe in India could be a plausible range, and then in the UK you would expect that maybe it's a fifth or something like that. Looking at that map, there were relatively few places that people live where the air was really clean by this standard. I guess in Norway there were some places that was really good, and and if you're far away from population centers, then you'll be okay. But it seemed like the great majority of people are breathing air that is, so that the WHO at least would say is not healthy.
That's right. Especially I think when you compare it against the updated guidelines of the WHO, it basically means that, I don't know, like 99% of the world's population breathes air that is insufficiently clean.
Yeah, if you want to breathe clean air, you have to move to the fjords of Norway. Okay, so that's the classic kind of life expectancy issue. But there's this whole other cluster that's been becoming more and more prominent, which is these effects on cognitive performance and mood and things like that. So yeah, I've read that there's bunch of studies suggesting, as you were saying earlier, that it harms school performance. To have polluted air makes you do worse at school, makes you do worse at your work, causes you to drive worse, make more mistakes. Potentially also affects mental health, like makes people more likely to have depression or commit suicide and things like that. Is there any way of kind of summing up the evidence on that? Because at the moment, there's just so many different papers looking at specific different outcome measures. It's a little bit hard maybe to aggregate it into a simple picture for me.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my take, which is possibly sort of more skeptical than others, which is given that there is something like there is a body of work that's emerging that seems to be pointing in a similar direction. There seems to be evidence to suggest that air pollution harms you and your productivity in a manner that is distinct from its harms on health, right? So it's not productivity that is getting harmed because you're falling sick more often, but productivity that is being harmed because of cognitive losses. So the magnitude of these impacts, I don't claim to be an expert on this stuff. And I in some sense, I'm a consumer of these results. And so the magnitude of these impacts, I suspect, will still have significant uncertainties and sort of publication biases and things like that. In some sense, the reason I'm sort of more comfortable with the global burden of disease type estimates is that it reflects a larger body of work. And although the causal identification with some of these public health papers may not always be up to scratch, they're relatively transparent about what they do and don't. And they're just more papers from different parts of the world at different levels of pollution, which once again, which seem to sort of back each other up. And I think on the cognitive and productivity stuff, it's still like a more nascent body of work, which is still pointing in the same general direction, but I just don't know if there has been enough of it.
Yeah.
So probably harmful to your cognition in a manner different. It's sort of in addition to like the impacts on your health, on heart disease and lungs and so forth. My own sense is that we don't yet know the magnitude to the level of certainty that we would like. So, for example, in our grant making, this isn't something that we actually factor into our cost effectiveness calculations. So far, it's been restricted to health impacts alone of prolonged exposure.
Yeah.
And I imagine that will be the case in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's really great because you're preempting where I was about to go next, which is kind of probing how confident can we be about these different papers suggesting that air pollution is having these different effects. I mean, yeah, listeners to the show will be familiar with the general idea that it's not uncommon for academic literatures to produce really striking, amazing results that then over time you end up with more qualifications and you get conflicting results and then you're not as sure as you initially were. And then when you do higher quality studies, sometimes the effects can disappear completely. And so I slightly worry that this could happen with some of these more cutting edge or speculative impacts that air pollution might be having. That said, there is almost certainly something going on here because one thing that's very nice about air pollution is that it's possible to get these quasi-random studies, basically, because the weather affects the weather is this external exogenous source of random variation that causes some days there to be much more pollution than others. So in as much as you're studying the direct immediate effect of air pollution on someone rather than its kind of cumulative effect over a lifetime of exposure, I know that there are these papers that economists have done where they'll look at people at a school, for example, that is, say, to the west of a road that produces a lot of air pollution because it's a highway. And they can compare days when the wind is blowing west, and so the school is getting exposed to lots of air pollution from this highway, to days when the wind is blowing east, when the air is a lot cleaner because the pollution isn't being blown over from the road. And they can see from test results, from standardized tests and so on, that the students do worse. They do materially worse on standardized tests on days where the air pollution is higher. I mean, of course, things could go wrong, and that your result could end up being wrong, but that's like relatively a credible kind of research design. Do you want to comment on that?
So a couple of my priors, right? So one, it's almost certainly the case that most of the health harms due to air pollution is because of prolonged exposure as opposed to short-term exposure, even to like extraordinarily high levels. So that's probably true. And therefore, like the short-term exposure and the studies that sort of estimate its impact on health or cognition, it's likely to be a relatively small fraction of the larger pie. It is true that there are these sort of quasi random variations in pollution levels that allow you to study the impacts of the short-term changes. One of my colleagues at Open Phil, who's with the cost prioritization team, who I think has thought about this stuff more carefully than me, Lauren Gilbert, is extremely skeptical of weather as an instrumental variable, and believes that sort of the current understanding in the econ literature on causal identification has basically sort of set aside weather as like a reliable source of exogenous variation. And
so just to clarify what you're saying, so instrumental variables is this method where you use something like the wind as this source of random exogenous variation that's not associated with other things, hopefully, and then see whether that affects test results. And then you hope that the only way that the weather could affect test results would be via it bringing pollution to the classroom. And are you saying that your colleague is skeptical that this is actually a sound research design, and that economists have become more skeptical of it?
That's right. And as a result, some of these papers that are sort of using weather as the principal IV, instrumental variable, may not eventually sort of stand up sort of scrutiny, and therefore might either have errors that are larger than sort of is estimated in the paper. It comes either the estimated impacts become sort of more muted, or they're just unable to make a claim once you sort of correct for some of these measurement errors, right? So again, that's the kind of stuff that sort of makes me a little skeptical of sort of the emergent literature. So once again, the same cautionary warning that I mentioned earlier. I do not claim to be an expert in causal identification methods and the strengths and limitations of IVs. And so I'm just sort of a consumer of this work, and it's like, well,
but you think we should take it with a pinch of salt?
Air pollution seems to be like a harmful thing. What can we do about it? Is sort of where my realm of experience begins.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we'll stick up some links to people who are analyzing this kind of question, trying to figure out, how much can we trust these new seeming research results on air pollution for people who want to look into that more. And we'll have to get someone who's working on that research in particular to dig into it in more detail at some future time, because I find it super fascinating. One thing you mentioned earlier that you had kind of declining marginal harm with air pollution. That is to say that the most damage is done by the first bits of air pollution that you're exposed to. And then at some point you're just screwed. And further, like having a little bit more or a little bit less doesn't make that much difference. That's a bit counterintuitive to me, because I would think like often you have this kind of model that the body can handle some level of abuse, but then beyond some point, it's no longer able to kind of repair the damage that's being done. And if that were the way that things are working, then you'd expect to have increasing incremental harm from each extra bit of air pollution, because the body would be overwhelmed. But I guess, are we reasonably confident that actually it goes the other way, that it's the first units that are the worst?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so to clarify, even at high levels of air pollution, there is likely to be some incremental harm. It's just that it's at the slope of the graph is sort of much
levels off.
Yeah, exactly. So it's steeper at the initial levels. It is counterintuitive. It also means a few things, right? One is that for places like Delhi, which have sort of abominable levels of air pollution throughout the year, for policy to be able to bring it down to levels where the health harms are brought as close to zero, they don't need to just improve by a little bit, but they need to improve by a lot. Right? Because sort of most of those gains are actually, at a level that's maybe like a third or a fourth of the levels that you see right now. So that sort of makes the challenge in many ways sort of steeper. It also leads to this potentially interesting conundrum on where you want to sort of prioritize your efforts. So for example, there's this paper called, which basically poses the question on whether you ought to be making blue skies bluer, which is that do you actually then focus on cities that are closer to, that inflection point?
Yeah.
And basically look to make them significantly cleaner and more livable. It seems like a very EA type sort of dilemma to ponder over.
Yes. Yeah, I like it because so the idea there is that if it's the first bit of air pollution that does most of the damage, then what you want to do is find places that are reasonably clean, not that bad, and then get them to be really clean. And that is a little bit counterintuitive as the most cost-effective thing to do, because usually the most cost-effective thing to do is to focus on the people who are suffering the worst of something rather than people who have the least of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, for better or for worse, right? It is a fact, though, that eventually the way policy seems to prioritize where resources are to be spent ends up being places like Delhi, where sort of the levels of pollution are just so high that they're obvious. It sort of becomes more politically salient, and that gets a bunch of media attention. So I don't know if this is actually something that is actually a dilemma that sort of faces policymakers. It possibly ought to be, but yeah, for better or for worse, I don't think it's actually like a serious question that government folks tend to sort of tackle.
Yeah. I'm planning to interview someone from the lead exposure elimination project later in the year. So lead is on my mind. Do you know if air pollution in India or elsewhere ends up inadvertently exposing people to lead, which we know is just extremely bad for people's health and cognitive development? It's really one of the worst poisons that we've ever systematically been exposing people to.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the mechanisms by which we get exposed to lead is, through air. We're also exposed to it, through food, through spices, and all that. A couple of points. One, trace levels of lead would technically be part of PM 2.5. Although because lead is as harmful as it is, regulators tend to measure that separately anyway and have separate standards for it anyway. There are some common sources of both sort of lead pollution and sort of particulate matter. For instance, improper recycling of lead acid batteries tends to make both worse due to sort of different dynamics. So there are relationships between the two. I'm unaware of any other literature that seems to suggest that air pollution makes the impacts of lead worse.
When I was growing up in Australia, there was leaded petrol. So I think cars, when I was a kid, were spewing out presumably lead, right, among other things, and I was just breathing it in. Mm-hmm. I guess lead petrol is not in India and not in most places these days, but it might still be in the fumes of industrial uses, possibly, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, the reason I didn't mention that is that fortunately, it seems to be something that's largely behind us. But yes, it's possible that that's still a factor from industries.
Yeah. Are there any surprising things that people should know about air pollution or kind of misconceptions that people often have that are worth clearing up?
Yeah. So I think one that is actually a significant sort of a hindrance to effective policy in India and similar countries is that air pollution is assumed to be an urban problem. This was certainly true in, sort of big industrial cities and so on, where sort of air pollution started becoming sort of visible and salient. So I'm thinking of London or Pittsburgh, Los Angeles. So in places like India, though, that's just not true, because rural air pollution can be significant. In fact, it's on average, rural exposure is not very different from urban exposure. One of the largest sources of air pollution exposure in India, in Pakistan, a whole bunch of other countries would actually be the household burning of solid fuels, wood and dung cakes and things like that. And so it's actually not at all an urban issue alone, and historically it has been treated as that. So, for example, there are no rural air quality monitors in India. And it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? So till recently, the response to why there aren't monitors there was that, look, we know villages are clean. That's where you go when you have respiratory problems and so on, right? And so it neither gets sort of measured because it's assumed to be not a problem, and because there isn't any measurement to suggest otherwise, that never really gets updated. So because there are alternative sources of data now, satellite data-based estimates of air pollution, for example, I think there is growing evidence that rural air pollution can be substantial, and therefore there has been a growing demand for air quality monitoring in rural areas. Another sort of misconception that in some ways we touched upon, right, is that there are sort of safe levels of air pollution. That it's only like the truly apocalyptic levels that one sees, for example, in winters in places like Delhi and so on. Only that's what harms you. That unfortunately just doesn't seem to be true. Impacts have been detected at much lower levels that were previously considered safe. An unusual type of misconception that's sometimes popular in sort of government circles is that air pollution is something that you can build immunity to.
Oh wow, I've never heard that one. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's something that as ridiculous as that sounds, right? I mean,
well, I guess it's like if you go out in the sun a lot, maybe you get a tan, which slightly helps you to not get sunburned. But I don't imagine your body can do that with particulate pollution.
Yeah, and I mean the idea is that like everything else. So there is sort of this insistence by, I certainly don't think all regulators, but by some, that Indian lungs, for example, are just better able to handle air pollution than, for example, American lungs, right? Because we've been exposed to it.
You're used to it, okay.
Over a period of time, so we've got used to it. So we don't routinely fall sick when the levels of air pollution are high, and when somebody's visiting Delhi or something, you feel it. You feel the difference quite viscerally, and so that clearly points to like Indian lungs being better adapted. I mean, that's of course nonsense, but yeah, it's unfortunately like a persistent myth that has sort of been hard to shake off. One of the implications of that also has been a general skepticism towards like the public health impact estimates from sources like the GBD here. So there's sort of an insistence that we need more indigenous research, sort of studying health impacts, in Indian populations, and that these extrapolations from other parts of the world are just not reliable. I mean, there is a truth to it, right? I mean, it is an understudied topic. There just isn't enough high quality cohort studies and so on in the public health literature on air pollution at sort of elevated levels of concentrations. There is some that's sort of emerging from China, but those are still levels that are lower than what one sees in North India. So there is some truth to there being like a significant research gap. I am, however, not as persuaded that then means that the sort of the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. I think I'm seeing that right.
Yeah. I mean, people do differ around the world, but I think one fortunate thing about humanity is that from a biological, medical, basic physical requirement point of view, humans everywhere are more similar than they are different. And I guess if we were finding that air pollution was doing people a lot of damage in America, I would tend to assume by default that could also be true in India, rather than saying, well, who can say? We need to prove it here as well. But I don't know.
Yeah. I think those are my favorite misconceptions. There might be others, but yeah, the immunity thing I think is a particularly fun one. Yeah.
An argument that I came across when doing background research for this was the observation that in recent decades the main environmental campaign, or the most prominent environmental campaign, at least in rich countries, or at least in English-speaking countries that I'm familiar with, I think by a decent margin has been climate change, preventing climate change, and is kind of famously hard to get people and countries to do stuff about climate change, because if you emit carbon, the damage that does is spread globally. It's spread everywhere, not just in your country. And it's not just this year, it's spread over decades or centuries. And people have been pointing out, given that air pollution seems to do so much harm to people's health, even in the US or the UK, it's still really quite substantial impacts on people's health relative to the things that we tolerate elsewhere. It's funny that we've focused on trying to get people to do this thing that's a really hard sell because of its public good, kind of global public good nature, when we could have instead perhaps been focusing on particulate pollution, which is kind of the reverse, in that you benefit very immediately because the air cleans itself up, but particulate pollution falls out, and you could be healthier really quickly if you closed up a coal plant nearby you. Mm-hmm. And it's like also, so it's really concentrated in time, and it's much more concentrated geographically, so that a given political unit that's voting on these decisions could benefit itself and doesn't have to worry about the benefits spilling out to other countries. And simultaneously, if you were closing coal plants to stop particulate pollution and replacing them with renewable energy or something else, else, then that would also have happened to have helped with climate change a very large amount potentially. So maybe even if all we cared about was carbon emissions, we would have done better to set that aside in terms of the public messaging and continue the environmental campaigns that were extremely prominent in the 60s and 70s around clean air and clean water, and sell that to the public and sell that to voters and politicians as a way of encouraging people to switch over to cleaner power. I know this isn't your specialty, but what do you make of that line of argument?
A couple of thoughts, right? So one, in some ways, it's understandable that this happened. Sort of the focus of the environmental advocacy group sort of pivoted from local air pollution to climate, simply because, places like the US, countries in Europe have made significant progress on air pollution over the last few decades, right? So yeah, I mean, the levels are like objectively lower, and therefore, I guess it's harder to animate folks in sort of thinking about the health harms, which is where I guess sort of the updated literature now is sort of becomes increasingly important. If it actually turns out to be the case that what we thought were safe levels are actually not safe, then there's clearly an argument to sort of reinvigorate that sort of strand of environmental advocacy. In places like India, though, I think civil society groups have actually been sensitive to this entire time, right? The fact that air pollution and climate change share several similar sources, that sort of similar types of actions can lead to benefits along both those dimensions. I think that's something that folks have grasped and sort of have actively been working with. So I don't necessarily think that that's a correction that, for example, environmental advocacy groups in India ought to be doing. In fact, there's been even in terms of like the literature on this work, there's this expression called co-benefits, which I mean, there are folks, for example, Navroz Dubash, whom I used to work with in the past while I was at the Center for Policy Research, who sort of strongly advocated for countries like India to adopt that lens of prioritizing actions based on co-benefits such as, improved health, improved quality of life in cities through like better public transport infrastructure and things like that, and not necessarily think about mitigating global greenhouse gases and sort of therefore using that lens even sort of in international negotiations and so on. So yeah, I think in the West, there's certainly, I mean, it's on the one hand, understandable why this sort of pivot happened. I think there's also increasingly a case to sort of pivot back towards sort of thinking of it from like a local health harms sort of lens. And I think in places like India, I think we've actually been approaching it from this lens.
People have already been alert to this.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, speaking of health harms in richer countries, or I guess like countries that have made a lot of progress on air pollution, I'm kind of, the majority of listeners live in the US, Australia, UK, some in continental Europe. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know how should people think about and approach air pollution in their own lives? How worried should they be? For example, we've had air purifiers in the office here and in my living room for the last couple of years. And when I was preparing for this interview, I bought another one for the bedroom to clean up the air that I'm breathing while I'm sleeping. Do you think, is that a sensible move for people to take in general, selfishly?
Yeah, I mean, I think defensive measures against air pollution is like an eminently sensible thing to do. I don't necessarily think it's a selfish thing at all. From like a public policy lens, this is actually an area that I've sort of struggled with as to, what should governments do, especially where in places where the pollution levels are much higher. Like, how do you think about encouraging people, typically the elite and higher income folks, to sort of install air purifiers and like, sort of in some ways look for private solutions to the problem of air pollution rather than like the harder politics of sort of mitigation. But yeah, I mean, I think it makes tremendous sense for you to sort of purchase that additional air purifier. Air purifiers work great. It's sort of one of those things that it's tech that works indoors.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not Yeah, I wasn't saying it's selfishly in a bad sense. I just mean from a personal point of view, is that
Sure,
is it worth the cost? And of course, even someone who can afford as many air purifiers as they would like eventually has to go outside. So it's not a very systematic solution to the problem, and it's not the most efficient solution to the problem. I think, given that we have lots of options potentially for reducing air pollution. One thing that I've noticed when there's all these websites online where you can just look up air pollution, like what's the quality of air in your area right now, and there's quite a lot of monitors in London. Something that I've noticed when checking that regularly is that it's incredibly local. That in London you can have like one suburb that's like really dirty right now, while another suburb adjacent has really quite clean air, and it will just change, flip between them, and that it also just varies enormously from day to day. Some days the air is super clean, some days it's super dirty. What's going on with why isn't the air mixing more between different suburbs?
So if you look at like an annual average basis, right? I mean, like the prolonged exposure standpoint, I'd be pretty surprised if some of that variation actually shows up. It's definitely the case that within short-term windows, there are local hotspots. This is true in virtually every city. Local sources like, even sort of significant traffic junctions and so on. I mean, that can make a significant difference to local air pollution. So hotspots are definitely a thing. But yeah, I think from a prolonged exposure standpoint, unless there is something weird like a polluting industry, or I'd be surprised if there are actually very large variations locally.
On average, you mean? When you average over the year?
On average. Yeah, exactly. It's also one of those things where weather and climate play a huge role in terms of both sort of variations over the course of the day, variations from one day to the next, and potentially, if there are cities which have significant microclimates, it's very likely that that will also translate into sort of spatial heterogeneity in air pollution. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so there has to be something going on where, just depending on the weather, the air can kind of get trapped in a particular area where it's not moving upwards, maybe because there's some temperature differential that's preventing that, or it's not blowing east or west, so the stuff's not getting removed, and so it can just build up in a local area. There was a couple of hours over the previous weekend. So to give people some sense of the scale, so ideally you should have below 5. So the measure is micrograms per meter cubed, but I just think about it in terms of the number, because micrograms per cubic meter means nothing to me. So ideally the air pollution levels of PM 2.5 would be under 5. I guess under 10 would be okay. I guess under 30 would still be kind of all right. There was a while in my part of London where it was over 150 over the weekend. Really very, very severe. And you can kind of see the smog out the window. And then it kind of just crashed down to 20 again a couple of hours later. So I don't know. People won't be surprised. One thing is when I got this air purifier, it actually shows the number. It shows that number on it because it's got a sensor that causes it to turn on or off. And that's caused me to have this sense of how the air quality in the area is changing over time, over the day, and just how much it varies, which is something that I had no intuition for previously. And it's made me a lot more alert to air pollution. I'm not sure that's entirely good because there's only so much you can do about it. But I wonder whether that's something that would be helpful for, if people had all of these monitors, if they were seeing these numbers regularly, I wonder if it would be a much larger political issue because people would appreciate what's going on. That they'd see that it's not just kind of steam in the area. It's actually pollution that's harming their health.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think London in many ways has been something of a leader on this, right? The density of the low-cost sensors that London has is extremely unusual, and is sort of becoming a bit of a model for other cities to sort of replicate when it comes to thinking about how one monitors air pollution. So traditionally, you basically had a few monitors, but these very sophisticated, expensive monitors in a few sort of carefully selected locations. But sort of since we've learned that they can actually be the kind of variation from one neighborhood to another, from one road to another, and so on. And that might actually be a reasonable thing to target the sources of that local variation, even in order to make a larger impact on the air quality in the city. There has been a growing sort of call for, how do you integrate things like low-cost sensors, which, didn't exist even 10 years back, in the sense we weren't sure about sort of the quality of the data that they produce. we've made significant progress in the last decade or so, have a reasonable handle on sort of their strengths and limitations. So there's this call to have hybrid monitoring networks, sort of complement the more expensive stuff with just a very large number of low-cost sensors to try and measure this variation. I'm curious, did you figure out what led to that sort of spike?
No. I couldn't figure it out. I did. It did cause me to Google where, are there fires in Europe that and maybe the smoke from the forest fires is blowing up? But no, there wasn't. I think it must have been something to do with the weather. I think trapping pollution in the area. But yeah, no, it's a little bit of a mystery. But I mean, I have noticed when I've checked it many times that it'll show you a graph of the increase and decrease over the day, and it is just super variable over a period of days. It will fly up and down all the time. That was just like the most extreme that I've ever seen.
Yeah, 150 I think is objectively bad.
Yeah. It was worse than most of India. Yeah. Okay, that's sort of about air pollution at a high level. Let's zoom in and talk about India and Indian cities, which is kind of the place you know the most about and the thing that you've been specifically tasked to work on. Is it a way of describing how bad is air pollution in India in particular, and like where is it the biggest problem?
Yeah, so going back to the number that you just mentioned, right? WHO recommending that the safe level is 5 microgram per meter cube. The population weighted average in India is something of the order of 80. And the most polluted parts of the country, in terms of an annual average, will have levels that are closer to something like 120, 130, right? And the times of the year where air pollution in India sort of makes headlines globally, we're talking about like 24-hour averages that are of the order of 400, 500. So I think that's, I guess, one way of thinking about the levels of air pollution. Alternatively, something like 80%, 76%, I think was the number that one of the papers had estimated, of Indians breathe air that is worse than the national standards. The national standards, by the way, are at 40, right? 40 microgram per meter cube. So there's a reasonable chance that the national standards are actually extremely lenient, and that even if a city was sort of compliant with it, that there was still sort of breathing air that's pretty harmful. But even relative to those national standards, more than 3/4 of the country breathe dirtier air. This is in particular a problem in northern India. In fact, if you sort of zoom out a little bit and look at South Asia, there's something called the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So basically the plains that are in some ways defined by the river Indus, and which is in Pakistan, and Ganga that flows through India. So basically spanning from the eastern Punjab province in Pakistan all the way across North India, covering several states, Rajasthan, Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, parts of Nepal, the plains in Nepal, so the southern part of that country, and all of Bangladesh, right? So this contiguous region, which is called the Indo-Gangetic Plain, has particularly high levels of particulate matter. And in some ways, it's sort of a large-scale version of what we just discussed in terms of, climate and sort of topography and so on playing an important role. Essentially, the Indo-Gangetic Plain is sort of this basin that's basically bound by the Himalayas in the north, right? And with like winds from the Indian Ocean sort of pushing and sort of keeping the air in, that therefore, sort of it becomes sort of a sink of air pollution, where in particular times of the year, it's very hard for the pollution to escape easily, leading to the very large numbers that we just went over. This is also an extremely densely populated part of the world.
So if people look at a map of air pollution in India, they'll see, well, it's an issue everywhere, but in the south, it's not nearly as bad as the north. There's this kind of strip, as you're talking about, this basin that runs from around Pakistan in the west towards Bangladesh in the east. It's like this big stripe. And roughly how many people live in that area?
So about 700 million people live, in this broader region. And Bangladesh is a densely populated country. Uttar Pradesh almost completely falls within this region, and it'll basically be one of the largest countries in the world if it weren't a state in India and was a country. Yeah, so that's sort of, I think, principally is sort of what makes this a significant public health crisis.
An expression I hadn't heard before, which I encountered preparing for this, is airshed. So it's an air analogy of a watershed. It's this area where the air just keeps circulating within this circle, and kind of add pollution in any part of it can potentially spread to any other part of this broader airshed. And I guess you're saying it's bound. This is created by the Himalayas on the north blocking the air from moving north, and then you've got the winds coming up from the sea and from the south of India, and you've got this pocket here that just where the air gets stuck, and so pollution that's produced by industry or farming or whatever can just circulate there for quite a long time before it manages to leave that area. And unfortunately, that also just happens to be the area where there's maybe the greatest concentration of people in India, more or less.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. One of the consequences of this idea of an airshed also means that for individual sort of cities and states to be able to make progress can actually be quite hard, because they're substantially affected by, sort of the regions that sort of around that city in a particular state. They might actually be dependent on actions in the neighboring state, the neighboring country even, making this a particularly tough nut to crack.
Yeah, so it's not as bad as climate change, but there's still a significant kind of public good externality issue here where, one city might pollute, and maybe most of the harm of that pollution is done in other cities, possibly other states, I guess, depending on where you are, conceivably even another country. I think one thing that you mentioned in the presentation is that in Delhi, say, roughly 40% of the pollution that someone might be suffering from outdoors in Delhi comes from Delhi, but 60% might be coming from elsewhere in this airshed. So it really is this kind of common. It has to kind of be this common project. Otherwise, it's very hard to make major progress on it.
Correct. And Delhi gets a lot of attention, but there are a bunch of cities that are sort of downwind of Delhi, which in many ways are affected by pollution from Delhi, right? And which, as a result, end up having even higher levels of air pollution. And sure, they're not as sort of populated as Delhi is, and they're not as large a city, but in many ways are sort of substantially dependent on Delhi sort of getting its act together. There are parts of the Indo-Gangetic Plain where, compared to the 40 or 50% that sort of Delhi sort of is responsible for its own pollution, the corresponding numbers might be as low as maybe 30%, right? And therefore completely dependent on actions outside. Something that the larger policy and regulatory infrastructure, at least so far, is just not well equipped to do.
Yeah. So at a high level, where does air pollution in that airshed come from? I'm thinking, there's like cars, there's, coal plants, there's industry and so on. Is there a way of breaking it down? Yeah. So there are multiple sources. So one way I like to think about this is that this is sort of a 19th, 20th, and sort of 21st century problems coexisting with each other. Right. So from like the 19th century, if you will, there is the question of like poor energy access, right? For cooking and heating and so on. And therefore a very large number of, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of people being dependent on solid fuels for like daily uses like cooking and heating, right? And so that continues to be widely prevalent, and that is a significant source of air pollution. That is likely to be the largest source, right? From among the 20th century sources, there are things like waste burning, which we sort of briefly touched upon earlier. Widely prevalent practice. So there's waste burning. There is road dust, for example, which is basically roads being poorly maintained, and as sort of vehicles go over it, it sort of breaks down a little bit, and it actually adds up to quite a significant fraction. And then there are the sort of more sort of standard sources that folks would be familiar with, things like vehicles, industries, power plants that sort of burn fossil fuels, results in greenhouse gases, but also leads to a bunch of different pollutants, which then sort of react in the atmosphere, eventually forming particulate matter. So particulate matter as a class, right, can get directly emitted from some sources, construction dust, road dust, from, to some extent combustion. But it also is something that gets formed in the atmosphere because other gases that have been emitted react and form particles that are less than 2.5 microns. Yeah, is it possible to give kind of rough percentages for how much, or like what fraction of it is coming from each of these different categories?
Okay, so let me start with a city like Delhi. Delhi is relatively well studied. There are multiple what are called source apportionment studies that try and attribute the contributions of different sources. For a city like Delhi, waste burning vehicular emissions, industrial and power plant emissions, and a variety of residential and commercial sources, mainly in the preparation of food, right? All of these are, give or take, sort of 20% plus or minus 5%, right? As classes, they're sort of roughly similar to each other. Now, each of these are actually fairly broad categories. Like among industries, you have power plants and other large formal sort of manufacturing plants and things like that. But then there are also a variety of sort of smaller enterprises, informal industries, like the battery recycling type things, or e-waste recycling. Again, these things can add up to quite a bit. So there are multiple individual sources that are part of these larger classes. With vehicles, for example, again, you have some subcategories like trucks, which might, there are a small number of vehicles on the road, but can have disproportionately large contributions, while the number of like cars and two-wheelers might actually be much smaller relative contributors. So for a city like Delhi, you almost have this sort of equalish split between these 4 or 5 broad categories of sources. At a national level, there seems to be evidence that suggests that household burning is the single largest source, accounting for something between 25 to 30% in terms of the ambient air quality exposure. This, by the way, is separate from the impacts it has indoors. And we can come back to this point later. About 10% each is from industries and power plants. And then you have smaller and smaller shares. So at a national level, vehicular emissions actually might potentially be in the single digits. And you have industrial and residential sort of actually accounting for the vast majority.
Yeah, so I guess an unfortunate bottom line from that is that there's no one thing that if we just targeted that would really solve the issue. Unfortunately, it's spread somewhat evenly across quite a lot of different sources. So in order to make big progress and reduce air pollution by half or 2/3 or 4/5, you're gonna have to deal with like five different categories in a pretty big way.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that also makes the air pollution in developing countries hard and also sort of different from air pollution as was sort of seen in the US or UK in the first half of the 20th century, right, where it was primarily dominated by industrial pollution and to some extent the use of coal for heating. There's just like a much wider variety of sources which sort of fall under different sort of government agencies which operate at different scales, and therefore making progress becomes harder to do. And you would have to make progress on each of these sources because they all contribute enough.
Yeah, one category you haven't mentioned yet is which gets a lot of coverage in the media is stubble burning, which is I think the burning of leftover crops as part of the growing cycle. Where does that fit into the picture? Is that a big source or a relatively small source?
So stubble burning is an important episodic source, right? In a sense, in the months of October and November, when air pollution levels sort of peak in North India, stubble burning actually is a significant contributor. It's possibly even the primary contributor in those few weeks, right? So much of the burning of crop residue happens over the course of like 3 or 4 weeks. So this is basically the residue that remains after paddy has been harvested and as the farmers get ready for like a new cropping cycle of wheat. And basically they have a narrow window in which the stuff has to be cleared out. The field is made ready for like a new crop, and burning it is sort of the fastest, cheapest way of like getting rid of it. And because it sort of coincides with the time when these other changes are happening to the weather, the stuff that gets emitted basically stays in the air for longer durations. It doesn't get cleared away very quickly, leading to apocalyptic levels of air pollution. So it's an extremely important source during those few weeks, not just in Punjab and Haryana where this happens, but really the pollutants travel. It's a significant contributor across North India. There is some evidence to suggest that it actually may travel hundreds of kilometers to even southern India and contribute a small share. So it gets a lot of attention because it is the principal source when air pollution makes news. Seen over the course of the year, it's not an unimportant source, but it's not nearly as important as the amount of sort of airwaves it receives. Whereas, stuff like household burning and so on are largely under the radar, despite sort of how important they are.
Yeah. Maybe one reason it gets attention, at least in the foreign media, is that it's so strange. Or, as someone from here, my question would be, why do Indians put up with this? Why don't they ban people from burning crops that's causing what you describe as apocalyptic conditions for them? I guess we don't want to get too caught on this because they're just saying as a percentage over the year of all exposure, it's not so large. But it is very striking.
It is striking. And it does lead to significant short-term sort of heightened exposure and therefore a significantly larger number than usual having to be admitted to the hospital because of breathing difficulties and so on. So it does have significant impacts on health. I guess part of the answer to you is that it's in fact banned. This is not something that is sort of allowed by law. It just happens at a scale that's so large and by a group that is sufficiently politically influential that there is very little that folks can do in terms of just enforcement. It's hard for governments to go around fining everybody who indulges in this. So yeah. But yeah. In fact, these are banned in the strict sense of the law.
Okay, yeah. So maybe we should come back to enforcement as a key issue later on, or the politics of it all. Is there any really important data that we wish we had about all of this that we don't have?
So one of the things that we don't have is sort of better measurement of air pollution in rural areas, right? It's the kind of thing that might also help with the monitoring of stubble burning and so forth. But the complete absence of air pollution monitors in rural India is a significant problem. So there's a very large part of this country and the region at large that's just where we don't have enough sort of visibility and insight into how pollution changes. Many cities in India are still under monitored. So Delhi actually is a pretty well monitored city at this point, but this isn't the case with virtually every other city. Compared to Delhi, which may have something like 40 to 50 monitors operational on any given day, most cities actually have 2, and so that remains a problem. With the source apportionment, like the numbers that I gave you on, for example, the contributions of household versus industries and power plants, most of these are based on the results of models. So these are not measured. These are estimated from a bunch of sort of atmospheric chemistry and dispersion models, relying on something called emission inventories, which are basically gridded estimates of emissions from different sources. The emission inventories are likely to be very wrong. So we just don't have a good measurement of how much is getting emitted, and that sort of becomes the basis for all these subsequent estimations of the relative shares of different sources and so on. We have substantial gaps to fill on the emission inventories, right? And those are pretty fundamental because without that, it's hard to be sure of how much different sources contribute. These estimates of how much of air pollution in Delhi is because of the neighboring states. All of these are sort of model generated. All of these are reliant on being reasonably correct about where the emissions come from. So that's a big gap. There are actually a whole bunch of fairly fundamental gaps in our understanding of air pollution.
Yeah. So in terms of the broader global picture, I think India has among the worst air pollution in the world. I think air pollution is getting worse in Africa at quite a rapid pace, and there's some countries in Africa that are now giving India a run for its money. I think DRC might now be the country, the largest, like a very large country that has made among the worst air pollution in the world. On the other hand, China has managed to reduce its air pollution levels by more than half over the last 10, 15 years. So they managed to make a lot of progress, and it's a less severe issue there now. But what's the trend in India over the last couple of decades? Is it kind of just getting worse as the country industrializes?
Yeah. So, at least till the till a few years back, the trend had been sort of almost a sort of a monotonic increase in sort of the levels of air pollution across India. There were parts of the country that, had virtually negligible sort of, or at least that had significantly cleaner air that had become much worse as sort of industrial and mining activity sort of sped up. So in general, if you looked at a map of air pollution in India, in many ways, it has sort of grown a deeper shade of red, and that region has sort of expanded over time, and sort of new pockets of high levels of air pollution. In the last few years, there's been something called the National Clean Air Program that has been largely restricted to cities. It's in many ways an imperfect program. It's sort of insufficiently funded, for example, and in many ways it's really sort of a start more than anything else. But I think there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic that levels have at least sort of plateaued a bit, maybe even reduced by 10-20% in some cities. Not nearly the kind of progress that sort of cities in China seem to have seen over the last decade. I think the estimates that between I'd like to say 2010 and 2020, China on average saw like a 30% reduction in PM2.5 levels. That might very well be higher now. So they have in fact managed to make significant progress. Whereas I think Indian cities sort of at an earlier stage of that process.
Yeah. So in terms of explaining why this kind of northern Indian airshed has among the worst pollution in the world, I mean, one thing is just it's incredibly densely populated. Another is that it's industrialized enough that there's quite a lot of pollution, but it's not maybe rich enough and developed enough yet that people feel wealthy enough to do a whole lot in order to reduce it. Oh, and also it's just an area where air really gets trapped. So air pollution that gets produced there doesn't just blow out to sea. So it can really build up over time. Are there other kind of possibly policy mistakes or other key factors in terms of India in particular, or the politics or the industry or the direction that the country's gone that has made air pollution worse?
So I think at a high level, it's less about policy mistakes than it has been about policy neglect, right? So the Air Act in India, sort of dates back to 1981. And in many ways, the regulatory apparatus that sort of resulted from the Air Act is sort of reflects the understanding, of that time, right? So the pollution control boards, there are pollution control boards at the state level and at the central or federal level. These have been primarily set up to deal with industrial pollution. Because at the time, sort of that was the general sense that, this has got to be an industrial emissions kind of a problem. Over time, and so like in the mid to late 1990s, primarily because of sort of civil society advocacy and the interventions of the judiciary, the Supreme Court of India, it sort of expanded to include vehicular emissions in big cities. But till maybe the middle of the last decade, like around 2013, 2014, 2015, where in many ways air pollution once again started becoming more visible in Indian media, and therefore, sort of it became sort of more salient. And there were a bunch of these source apportionment studies that got commissioned and got publicized. That was it. So that was basically the extent to which the regulatory apparatus was ready. So these other sources like waste burning or household burning, they were completely neglected, right? Household burning, for example, and I think we've still not sort of recovered from that. It's assumed that the household burning of solid fuels is something that leads to indoor air pollution, and that really doesn't have much of an impact on pollution outdoors. That's just not true as per the literature. And so that's sort of been completely neglected and sort of treated as sort of a distinct problem. Because the regulatory apparatus has been set up for industrial pollution, the pollution control boards are not really well equipped to deal with sort of the updated understanding of where air pollution seems to come from, and therefore what you ought to be doing about it, right? So if you consider, for example, waste burning, this is something that really falls under the jurisdiction of the municipal corporations, the local government. The municipal corporations have never had to think about air pollution like ever, right? This simply isn't something that they think of as something that falls under their mandate till at least very recently. And therefore, the agencies that are supposed to be doing something about air pollution. The pollution control boards don't have the jurisdiction on this source. The agencies that do have the jurisdiction are just, they have not had the regulatory experience or the capacity to deal with this. And therefore it has sort of fallen between the cracks a bit. In terms of policy missteps, though, when it comes to industrial pollution, the regulatory regime in many ways has sort of not been designed in a manner that is flexible enough and sufficiently in sync with sort of the challenges of regulation in the field, right? So with industrial emissions, typically the way regulation functions is that all of these industries that pollute have chimney stacks, right? From where the flue gas and the other pollutants escape. For the longest time, across the world, regulation was basically about like the height of the chimney stack. So the assumption was that you make that tall enough and the impacts are not sort of felt in the immediate vicinity, which is not untrue, except that the pollution can travel and over time, all of this adds up. And so the sort of the next generation of regulation in many ways was to set standards for what the concentrations of pollutants in these chimneys could be. So there is a mechanism by which the pollutants are measured in the chimney. You sort of compare it with what the regulatory standard ought to be. In order to comply with these standards, the industries basically install a bunch of pollution control equipment, scrubbers and filters and things called cyclones and so on, which are meant to sort of clean up the air. And regulators basically measure this from time to time. If you're found to be above the standards that have sort of been given to you, there is some form of sort of punitive action, right? The way this mechanism has been set up in India has sort of relied on sort of what are called command and control instruments, right? So basically there is a standard. You're meant to be under that standard. Somebody comes and measures this from time to time. If you're above that standard, it is a criminal offense. And therefore, there's going to be like a lawsuit filed against you. You could land up in jail and sort of pay a fine of some kind. In practice, the legal system in India is sort of backed up. Most cases take years and years and years. If the actual compliance against these standards is quite poor, so even sort of based on some data from a few years back, something like 50% of industries in the state of Maharashtra, for example, were not in compliance with the particulate matter norms. So there's widespread non-compliance. The pollution control boards are understaffed. There is no real mechanism by which they can go after these many industries that are flouting the law. As a result, for the most part, the regulatory regime just sort of fails, right? So if a particular industry is found to be non-compliant, there is sort of a gentle slap on the wrist. There is some kind of polite correspondence where the regulator writes to the industry and sort of asks them to sort of explain themselves and sort of ends with that. There is very little action sort of taken. So the policy misstep, I guess, is that the sort of evolution that the regulatory framework should have had over time from being reliant purely on these extremely rigid, some may say even sort of draconian command and control type regulations towards a wider variety of sort of more flexible tools that allow the regulator to sort of levy fines, right? Without having to like file a criminal lawsuit and so forth. That evolution just did not happen. And as a result, non-compliance became sort of widespread. The amount of industrial activity in the country increased. The pollution control boards were never really able to sort of keep up with it. And the one sort of source of air pollution that ought to have been sort of regulated well also did not see sort of much progress.
I'll try to sum it. So there's a whole lot of things that have potentially gone wrong. One is that the legislation in this area kind of only looks at industrial pollution primarily, agricultural sources, household burning, waste management, I guess, roads falling apart. That stuff is kind of ignored because that wasn't really on people's radar in the 80s when this was written. So that's a massive problem. And then even in the area that the legislation is focused on, industrial pollution, the mechanism of enforcement is that occasionally someone will show up and try to measure whether you're in compliance, but presumably they're not super well resourced, so the checks are not very frequent. And then even if they do find that you're non-compliant, the enforcement mechanisms at that stage are so impractical, taking someone to court, which might take years to even get a hearing, that if you're an industry player and you don't want to follow the rules, you can just kind of wait out you can break the rule, hope that you don't get caught, and then even if they do catch you, then you just keep them stuck in correspondence, and ultimately, like, no one's ever really going to come and shut down your factory or force you to change your ways. So, I mean, in that picture, it's almost surprising that things aren't worse, because it seems like there's like very little in a way being done to prevent air pollution.
That's exactly right. And thanks so much for summarizing what I assume took several minutes. Yeah, I mean, I think what the regulators have therefore sort of done, and I guess minimized the extent to which things can go horribly wrong, is that they're sort of focused on industries that are sort of known to be egregious polluters, right? Are like sort of known problem cases, and sort of largely restricted their attention to them. And the vast majority of non-compliant industries, sort of were just ignored for the most part. I mean, arguably, Rob, air pollution in India is about as bad as it could possibly be. So
I see. There's not much worse place to go. Okay. So in a sense, this is nice because it means that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. It seems like it's obvious what changes you could potentially make if the government were really up to the task. So you could, create regulations around air pollution that covered a far wider range of sources. You could properly resource the agency that's meant to enforce it. You could give them many more gradations of possible punishments. Like you're saying, you could use fines that they're just allowed to impose without having to take anything to a court. From what I've heard, I think you mentioned in a talk that, oddly enough, in India, when air pollution comes up, the government often turns to, or city governments can turn to outdoor air purifiers, for example, as a possible solution. Maybe because it's very visible and it kind of looks cool, but is incredibly expensive and incredibly ineffective, as you might imagine. Sticking an air purifier outside, there's only so much that is possibly going to do if you haven't done anything to control the source of the air pollution. What is going wrong there? Why aren't people able to kind of fix these problems, given that it seems kind of obvious what improvements there might be?
Right. So starting with the outdoor air purifiers, right? So I guess the charitable way of seeing it, I mean, I'm a fairly optimistic person. So I guess one way you could see this is that this in some ways is a manifestation of the public demand for like cleaner air going up, and like governments at least being forced to do something. And sort of smog towers, as they're called, you could imagine sort of the case for them, right? That they're sort of plausibly useful. Like they'll do something. They're sort of physical, visible manifestations of the intent of governments to like clean up the air. And perhaps equally importantly, it leaves nobody worse off, I guess, in the near term. So
because taxpayers.
Yeah, the taxpayers, but it's sort of it's not as visible.
Spread very widely.
Exactly. And so that's one reason why smog towers are so attractive, that you don't actually have to, like, most regulation has winners and losers. And so here, except for, I guess, the taxpayers who might not be noticing it, nobody's really left worse off. And therefore it's sort of politically very viable. But yeah, I mean, let's be clear. This is an absolute waste of resources. They will do absolutely nothing. I mean, sure, they may clean up the air like a couple of meters away from wherever they are stationed, but that's it's highly ineffective. Part of the problem here seems to be that the sources are visible, sure. For some of them, there are like obviously good longer term actions that you ought to be taking. So vehicles are a problem. You need to like reduce the number of private vehicles on the road. You need to reduce the number of dirty vehicles on the road. So you can have a bunch of policy actions that try to clean up the fleet that could potentially, sort of improve the public transport infrastructure in cities and things like that. But in the near term, that sort of most governments try to sort of optimize for, right? One of the challenges is that we don't have like a menu of easy to implement sort of scalable solutions. I think that has been one of the challenges. And I think I think there's a legitimate uncertainty on, if you were a municipal commissioner, right, in one of the Indian cities, or you were the secretary for in the Department of Environment at a state level, and you had a pot of money to be able to deploy. I do think that there is a certain gap in terms of saying, okay, well, here are sort of the top 10 things that you ought to be doing. Here are like the sort of the most cost-effective interventions that you ought to be investing in. I think that's actually a significant gap in the literature. It's not sufficient to say that, you need to have more buses on the roads. That might not be under your mandate. That might be much more expensive than you can afford in the near term with the sort of constraints you've got. And I think that's been one of the challenges with sort of being able to make progress in India. As a result, for the most part, what the cities have been doing is basically dust control type measures, right? Having these mechanical street sweepers clean up the roads. Like they'll do something. We don't necessarily know how much they actually improve the air pollution, even on these roads. That's, for example, some of the stuff that we've just funded to try and like get a handle on how much of an impact this might truly have. It's not obvious at all that these are cost-effective things to be putting your money behind, but it's the kind of thing where it's not expensive enough to, for the government agencies not to be able to procure them. And again, it's the kind of capital investments that the corporations can do more easily than some of the harder sort of improvements in terms of how you operate, how waste management in a particular city functions. I mean, that's like a systemic thing, right? It's much easier to like purchase 10 of these street sweepers or something, put them on the road and hope to God that it sort of makes a difference. And unfortunately, that's what they've been doing.
Yeah. Isn't there also an issue that dust particles tend to be relatively large, which means that they're less likely to cross the blood barrier into the lungs and into the rest of the body? I mean, so like actual like soil dust, I think, is rarely under that PM 2.5 threshold that makes things particularly dangerous.
That's true. I mean, I guess there is, in sort of their defense, there is a fraction of the dust particles from roads, from construction activities that are actually finer than 2.5. But your point is well taken. I think that's exactly right, that by focusing on dust control, you're probably spending your resources on larger particles that are, relatively innocuous.
Yeah, something that's very visible, but not quite as dangerous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so a key issue or a key barrier potentially is that governments don't have a clear menu, a clear smorgasbord of here's the cheapest way to abate air pollution per dollar. Here's the easiest way to do it, and then they just start working down. Instead, they're grabbing at things somewhat scattershot that are very visible and don't create identifiable losers who are going to campaign against it. So maybe let's dive in and try to think about that menu. What are some of the best kind of object level interventions or changes that could be made at a technical level to industry, to transport and so on, that would do a lot to reduce dangerous air pollution at relatively little human and financial cost?
I guess part of that preface on like not having that list of actions also means that I don't necessarily have a great.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anybody does. I mean, that's just one of the challenges.
Yeah.
That said, some of like the almost certainly low hanging fruits or no regret measures in some ways is basically anything that improves energy efficiency, right? Anything that makes vehicles more efficient, anything that makes industries more efficient. Most energy efficiency type interventions tend to pay for themselves over time and will almost certainly reduce the amount of fuel that gets burned. The lesser fuel that's burned, the lesser pollution there will be, right? So as a general class of actions, anything that improves the combustion, the efficiency of the combustion of coal, the use of fuels. The next sort of set of things will likely be on household air pollution, right? I mean, so this is a slightly harder source to be sure of, right? So, like I mentioned, there are tens of millions of households that rely on the use of solid fuels to some extent. Some might be sort of exclusively dependent on them. Some might be using for 50% of their cooking needs, right? The cleaner fuel to be using here would be liquefied petroleum gas. Perhaps the cleanest one would be induction cook stoves and electric cook stoves. But that sort of depends on you having reliable electricity and so on, which is another problem, which sort of in many ways precludes this as a serious option in rural areas, right? Historically, liquefied petroleum gas used to be subsidized. A couple of years back, the subsidies were removed. I mean, there was a large government program at the federal level to provide something like 80 million households connections to like this cleaner gas, right? But over time, the subsidies themselves for continued usage of the LPG was sort of removed, was discontinued, right? They have recently been reintroduced, but at like modest rates, but they're likely to be insufficient. This is perhaps at a policy level, the most important intervention that will have sort of large improvements in air quality associated with and so on. It's also incredibly expensive, right? Just from a fiscal standpoint. This will likely cost something like 10 billion a year, perhaps more. Yeah, I mean, it much of the LPG also gets is based on sort of imports, and therefore there is a larger sort of energy security question associated with that as well. All of this has made the federal government sort of reluctant to reintroduce subsidies at a larger scale. So while it is likely to be pretty cost effective for a government program, by which I mean sort of a back of the envelope estimate I had was that this may cost something like $800 per Dali averted, which would not be a give well top charity level thing, but for government policy that might actually be incredibly cost effective because of the sheer sort of fiscal costs that it sort of entails. It's been hard to make progress on this particular action.
Or it's something that was tried, but then I guess just the cost was so great that governments didn't want to continue these subsidies indefinitely, which I guess makes some sense in a kind of lower middle income country like India. Okay, so we've got the first cluster was energy efficiency, which I suppose a general stylized fact that people claim is that around the world, businesses and individuals, households, they don't invest enough in improving energy efficiency, even in order to maximize profits. Maybe because it moves all of the costs up front and the benefits come over a long period of time. People tend to delay investments in new equipment that would improve energy efficiency. That's something that could be relatively cheap over the long term, that could reduce emissions a whole lot. And not only would it reduce burning of fuel, but in many cases it might mean getting new equipment, which presumably might be better on emissions as well, simply because it was new and the most updated, car or whatever. So one thing that you pointed out in one of your talks is that household waste burning is much worse than you might think. So not only is it probably the largest single category, largest single source of particulate pollution over this airshed, but it kind of double dips. So we've been talking about outdoor air pollution mostly today, but if you talk about air pollution as a whole, I think that the standard measures from the World Bank and World Health Organization and so on are that roughly 2/3 of the health damage from air pollution is done outside, from outdoor air pollution, and 1/3 is done by indoor air pollution. So you've got kind of 6.6 million people roughly, say, dying from outdoor air pollution and 3.3 roughly dying from indoor air pollution. And now when someone burns wood or something in their house in order to stay warm or in order to cook food, they firstly suffer the indoor air pollution in the first place because they're right there next to this burning thing that's producing ash. And it goes outside. Almost all of it leaves the house and it goes and then affects everyone else across the entire airshed on an enduring basis. So because it's occurring in the household rather than in a factory that's significant, like that people aren't living in, it really gets this extra penalty. And so that's one reason why indoor air pollution from fuel burning has been an issue that I've heard about for 10 or 15 years, as this is a kind of underrated issue across the developing world. Unfortunately, it sounds like there's not a really cheap solution to this because the alternative cleaner fuels, electricity is not that reliable and natural gas is expensive. Oh, you're saying it's liquid petroleum gas. Is that different than the gas that I'm familiar with?
It's the same. Yeah, very similar.
Okay, same thing. Okay, and I imagine that given that gas prices have gone up a lot over the last 18 months, it's probably even worse. It's even more expensive now to try to get people to switch. Just to clarify one thing, what are people burning in their houses for fuel? Is it wood or charcoal, coal?
So it depends on which part of the country. And I mean, I guess it's to sort of expanding beyond India. It depends on what's sort of easily available around you. So if you're sort of access to firewood, that's what you would use. If you are part of a region where, sort of coal mining happens or coal and charcoal are relatively easily accessible, that's something folks use. If cow dung, for example, is available in plenty around you, folks sort of pat them down and sort of make these things called dung cakes, which are also used plenty. Folks use kerosene, but that's once again relatively expensive compared to these. So these tend to be the non-clean sources, if you will, of cooking energy.
Okay, so I guess the arguments in favor of focusing on fuel burning inside houses is that it has this extra penalty in terms of the health effects. And I suppose it's a huge source and very scalable to try to get people to stop burning the dung cakes and instead get them to switch to some other source of cooking energy. It seems like it might be kind of, it's not super low-hanging fruit. It's not going to be trivial to persuade the government to spend lots of money on this. And maybe this is something that would get solved over time as the country got richer and could afford, middle-income countries to rely on electricity or other sources more. Actually, one thing that occurs to me is maybe the key issue here is the electricity reliability. If that's why people in rural areas are not willing to just rely on electric cook stoves, which I don't think are super expensive, then maybe what we desperately need to do is get them a reliable source of electricity. And conceivably, even if that electricity was produced by burning coal, maybe that would be a significant improvement from an air pollution point of view.
No, I think that's true, and that's exactly right. A couple of things, though, right? One is that people's cooking habits is one of those things that is pretty sticky. So folks have been burning, firewood and other solid fuels for cooking basically since the beginning of time, whatever, right? It's the kind of thing where you may have specific preferences for food cooked in a particular way that rotis, bread, taste better or something when it's sort of cooked on a solid fuel-based cook stove. I don't know if this is true, but it's possible that there are these very specific preferences that folks may have on in terms of how food tastes and how food ought to be cooked. Even among sort of higher income urban households who actually have reliable electricity, getting them to move away from gas and use electric stoves instead is not a trivial sort of transition to happen. I mean,
well, it's not trivial in the United States or the UK either. People like their gas stoves here as well. So I think that's something, it's very, very relatable.
Exactly. And so that's one of those challenges. Now, if the cost of gas increases and it becomes less and less viable, I mean, I guess that's one way in which you can sort of persuade more folks to sort of make the transition. But it's not an easy one. So solving the reliability thing, which, by the way, has its own set of complexities involved, providing reliable, affordable electricity across rural India likely means you're probably doubling down on coal in the near term when it comes to electricity generation. So there is a bit of a trade-off that probably exists out there. But even if you solve this sort of reliability question, there is the matter of getting people to get the right kinds of stoves, the right kinds of appliances that can sort of run on like the induction stoves, be willing to sort of make those changes in their cooking habits and so forth. That might potentially be hard. Gas in some sense is easier, therefore, right? I mean, it's a more aspirational fuel. It is obviously cleaner. At least the women who end up doing the vast majority of cooking in most of these homes would vastly prefer the gas over solid fuels. They have to bear the brunt. I mean, it's highly inequitable how sort of the burdens of indoor air pollution in particular are shared, across genders. So in some sense, like gas is the easier lift if the government was sort of persuaded that, that 10 billion a year or whatever it is was worth it. It's more amenable to like a top-down sort of one-time type thing than. And those types of policies are easier to implement than stuff that is sort of more nuanced, requires
more boutique,
millions of people. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're getting a bit of a picture of some of the challenges here. So the picture I'm getting of governance around this issue in India is that people aren't paying a super high amount of attention to it necessarily, and when people do pay attention to it, they don't necessarily have a great idea of what the cheap options are for addressing it. And also just this is an area where there's a lot of people who are still really quite poor. They're living in poverty and they can't afford to use gas necessarily. They can't afford to switch the equipment that they're using because it's just really, these rural areas are really quite poor. And the government doesn't necessarily have the tax revenue to make changes that might seem sensible in a somewhat richer country. So I guess I feel like we have a decent grasp now of the household fuel issue. Is there kind of another category of change that looks promising that you'd like to learn about more, or maybe the government should be considering making changes in?
I guess one general class of pollution sources where in some ways there has been more movement than others is on the vehicular emissions side. If you have to reduce air pollution from vehicles, you need to get the dirtiest vehicles off the road, move the fleet at large towards cleaner and cleaner vehicles, as a general sort of urban transportation policy, try and incentivize or otherwise sort of move folks from relying on private vehicles to public transport, and in general from like motorized transport to sort of non-motorized transport, although I think that's sort of a heavier lift. I mean, India is a pretty hot country. It's in many ways hard for folks.
What's non-motorized transport, like bikes or push bikes?
People sort of walking and biking for their commute, right? And so getting folks who've sort of got used to like driving motorbikes to sort of start cycling in a hot city is probably harder, and also requires sort of significant infrastructural investments and changes in just the way the cities are designed. And so it's a non-trivial thing. Now, one of the areas where we've actually managed to make a lot of progress is in moving the fleet at large towards sort of significantly cleaner vehicles. So, for example, a few years back, primarily because sort of judicial intervention, India sort of moved from the Euro Stage 4 equivalent vehicular standards to Euro Stage 6. So these are cleaner vehicles running on sort of cleaner fuel with better sort of pollution control equipment installed inside. So the vehicular exhaust is much cleaner by like a couple of orders of magnitude in terms of some of the pollutants that get emitted, right? So that was like a big win. For that to lead to tangible improvements in air quality, basically you need to sort of wait out. Most vehicles sort of get, depending on the type of vehicle, whether it's a two-wheeler or a car, they get replaced, every 5 to 10 years. And so that particular policy action will sort of bear fruit, really over the course of a decade. I mean, I guess another way in which you can reduce vehicular emissions is to sort of have a robust vehicular inspection sort of program, right? So basically all the vehicles get themselves tested from time to time. There's a certificate that these sort of meet the standards. This is the kind of thing where sort of the Indian state is unlikely to be particularly effective. Right. I mean, this is an easily gameable sort of inspection. You can pay a very modest bribe, like less than $1, and get like one of these certificates that sort of say that you're clean. It's very hard to improve that infrastructure then, because there are a very large number of operators who are certified to like give these clean certificates out. The vast majority of them are susceptible to very small bribes, and that's the kind of problem where it's hard to tighten the vehicular inspection thing. So you're probably, I mean, the best course of action is to sort of internalize that reality in terms of what state capacity is and what can and cannot be implemented, and the moving vehicles to a cleaner fleet strategy, I think, is something that not just now, even in the past, has sort of been an effective way for advocacy to sort of function and sort of ask for. So that's likely to be an area where we've already made a significant improvement with the introduction of electric vehicles. Now, there's a strong case for more and more people to shift. It's very likely that my next car is an EV, right? And that'll be true for most people out there. It'll just make more and more sense. The infrastructure to sort of charge these vehicles and so on will sort of only get better over time. So I think in general with vehicular emissions, there is a lot of promise for things to sort of organically get better and for like incentives to be sufficiently well aligned for that to happen. The challenge in the near term is what you can do about identifying the most harmful vehicles on the road.
Okay, so transport is this other big category, and there's quite a lot of things that could potentially be tried. I suppose, one thing would be, ideally, I suppose Delhi and other cities in India might have wonderful underground metro systems, but that's hard to build anywhere and potentially quite a challenge to scale up. And it's difficult to get people to go on their bikes or to go walking places because it's incredibly hot. That's borderline sadistic. So what on earth are we going to do? One option would be to try to find all of the old gas-guzzling cars that are producing tons of smog, the kind of thing that drives me insane on the on the streets of London.
Yep.
And pull them off of the street. But unfortunately, that is very challenging because there's just too high a level of corruption, and people who want to keep driving a car like that will almost certainly be able to work around these regulations and just keep going until the car breaks down. So the more practical idea in that vein is instead to have higher standards for what cars can even be sold in the country and say, well, look, we're never going to get these cars off the road. So anything that we sell is just going to keep driving for 20 years potentially. So we need to get ahead and change the rules so that the cars that we're selling now are cars that we're happy to have on the road in 10, 15, 20 years' time. Presumably these cars that are better in terms of air pollution, better in terms of energy efficiency, are somewhat more expensive. Do you have any sense of how expensive that is relative to the improvement in air pollution?
No, I think these actually, again, I think this is likely a very cost-effective policy action. In a sense, sure, like the upfront costs for most of these will be higher, and I guess it depends on the specifics of the type of vehicle, on how much more expensive it may be. But these are costs that are borne privately in most instances, and are also likely costs that they'll pay for themselves in terms of like the reduced fuel expenditure and so on over time. So these are actually likely to be pretty cost effective. Identifying the most gas guzzling vehicles on the road, which are visible polluters, that's a harder one, right? I mean, identifying them, if it's not sort of visibly the case, is hard. And I guess there are sort of different shades of smoke and so on that one can't possibly identify. In fact, this may also look very different in different cities. So Delhi, because of court interventions and also in general, like efforts by the state government and the federal government, compared to most other cities in India, has significantly more stringent rules on which vehicles can ply on the roads. As a result, I mean, you'd actually have a hard time finding very obviously polluting vehicles on Delhi's roads. Diesel vehicles, diesel cars that are more than 10 years old are just not allowed to ply there anymore. So this is hard to do at a national scale. And unfortunately, what often happens is that the vehicles that get off Delhi streets don't necessarily get scrapped, but really show up in like other cities.
They just go somewhere else.
Yeah, and so those cities then like really get messed up.
Yeah.
Because they may not really get one of these restrictions possibly ever, or at least in the foreseeable future. So that's been a bit of a challenge.
Let's just talk about this court intervention for a second, because something that was quite striking when I was doing background research here is the role that courts have played in air pollution in India over the years. As someone who's not from India, it kind of struck me that courts were playing a borderline legislative role. Maybe in the absence of actual politicians doing anything, courts felt that they had to step in and kind of legislate from the bench in order to try to make some of these changes.
Yeah.
I understand. I mean, I'm sure that so there's lots of cities across this region, but in Delhi specifically, there was court cases where I can't remember what court, but some court said these private buses and public buses in India are too polluting. We have to get new buses and they have to use natural gas. That's like how we are going to interpret the law. And then this didn't happen for a while, maybe because it was too expensive or people weren't willing to spend the money on it. And then ultimately the court just insisted that they come off the road, even though new buses hadn't been purchased. And so this whole private bus system kind of disappeared. And unfortunately, it wasn't replaced by cleaner buses. It was replaced with people driving cars or using other ways to get around. So it really backfired and probably made the problem worse, and possibly made things worse. And it's kind of an interesting example of maybe courts don't have necessarily the flexibility or the understanding to be doing these kinds of, like what you might expect a government agency to be doing, like setting different priorities and figuring out where they want to spend money and how to most cost effectively reduce air pollution. Is there anything else you want to say about the role of courts in this overall picture?
Yeah, I mean, so like you said, right? I mean, the judiciary has played an outsized and in many ways like a completely unintuitive role in air pollution regulation in India. Basically, there's this instrument of public interest litigations that, that have been instrumental in leading to these court judgments. Some of these PILs, by the way, are still active, right? So there are cases that were initiated in the mid to late 90s that are still running today.
Sorry, you're saying that the court cases are still ongoing?
The court cases are still ongoing. Okay. And so, in a sense, there have been multiple sort of orders and judgments, but it hasn't sort of concluded. And the court continues to sort of play this quasi-executive, sometimes quasi-legislative, sometimes role in sort of designing policy. Some of those interventions, I think, were ultimately good and resulted in improvements. Some of those judgments have actually been pretty poor. the courts are simply not the places for some of these decisions to be made.
Yeah, in general, we don't expect courts to be a good place to be doing cost-benefit analysis and setting budgets and so on. That's like not their strength. It's not the strength of lawyers.
And that's exactly right. And it's also not the place where you necessarily have a democratic reconciliation of like the various people who are affected by the judgments. I mean, the case that you mentioned on like the getting the buses off the road and this mandate that buses can only run on compressed natural gas. It's not obvious if the state government or the federal government would have made that call because it's not obvious that it sort of passes muster in terms of, who's left worse off. It did paralyze public transport in Delhi. It's also true that we can be reasonably confident that Delhi's air quality actually improved for almost a period of 5 to 8 years as a result of that ban. Like you said, the long-term impact was that more people then relied on private vehicles because the number of vehicles in Delhi boomed. And that sort of was the reason there was an uptick again in pollution levels, which eventually resulted in sort of increased attention and increased acknowledgement of the problem in, 2014, 2015. The catalyst in 2014, 2015 was unfortunately again the courts, right? So there has been that sort of problem of policy neglect has sort of manifested in the executive and to an even larger extent, the legislature sort of completely ignoring the problem and the judiciary having to step in. The judiciary is sort of limited to fairly blunt instruments. The courts are not the places for cost-benefit analysis, as you put it. And that has unfortunate consequences. That's increasingly less and less the case, though. The courts have become less activisty over time. The smog-taverse in Delhi, by the way, was a direct result of a court judgment.
The what, sorry?
The outdoor air purifiers.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, that came as a direct result of... The courts basically demanded that, Supreme Court demanded that these be set up because something has to be done for Delhi's air quality.
Yeah. Right. This is a little bit embarrassing, but I don't know whether does Delhi have a metro system or an underground, or is that common in cities in India? And is it possible to expand them? Is that an approach that we should be considering?
It is possible. From a cost-effectiveness standpoint, urban transport folks tend to sort of stress that buses and like a good bus infrastructure moves more people at significantly lower costs and also like sooner, right? In the sense that metro systems take a while to build, takes years and years.
I think in the UK it takes 5, 10, 15 years to build a station. Yeah,
exactly. Buses, and in that sense, it's sort of much more modular. You can sort of increase your bus fleet. It can sort of reach the last mile in ways the metros can never really do.
Yeah.
But the Delhi metro is sort of the largest metro system in India. And virtually every other city is getting a metro of some kind. It's sort of become this aspirational piece of infrastructure for a city to boast of, right? Like a city is better developed if it has a metro system. But it's not obvious that was the right step from a cost-effectiveness standpoint.
Okay. Have you looked into buses and maybe advocacy around improving buses as a method of public transport as a possible way to reduce air pollution?
So from a grant-making standpoint, we've actually done very little on transport emissions, partly because it's a relatively mature field. There are a larger number of organizations. There is funding from among the climate foundations, for example, to do some of this work. So it's not as neglected as some of the other sources of air pollution. The other reason is that if you had to justify these grants from a purely air pollution standpoint and sort of not think about what it means in terms of improved, like increased incomes because of greater mobility and improved quality of life, things like that, which would be the case for me, it becomes harder to justify the public transport stuff somewhat.
All right, well, let's set that aside because I've got lots of other questions on other topics. One thing that's jumped out earlier is this issue that there's no effective regulation of industrial pollution, I guess, from both stationary power plants and from actual non-electricity generation industry. That the regulations aren't really fit for purpose, and then people can potentially flout them. Now, one thing would be to say, well, India state capacity here isn't really up to the task of regulating these industries very well. Evidently the laws on the books are not terribly good. The agencies aren't very well resourced. Maybe there's some degree of corruption involved as well. And so maybe we just have to live with in that reality. But an alternative approach would be to say, no, this is actually key, and this is the thing that we need to fix, is we need to get this agency properly resourced. We need to change the legislation so that they can impose fines. We need to make sure that they can't wheedle out of it and just buy time. Have you looked into that as a general approach to cost-effectively reducing air pollution?
Yes. Making progress on industrial emissions is likely one of the more tractable things to do here. And you have a regulatory apparatus. It should be possible that from a state capacity standpoint, these agencies are able to plug some of those gaps, hire additional staff, and be able to regulate industrial emissions better. We have a couple of grants which are sort of governance support in nature and sort of providing fairly broad-based assistance to state governments. And in some instances, they have been working on industrial emissions. Unfortunately, it's an area where, we should be able to do more grant making and just haven't done enough so far.
Well, it's you're being harsh on yourself. It's early days. You're only in year 2.
Yeah, sure. But that is true. But at the same time, I guess and we can talk a little bit more on sort of what the portfolio looks like at the moment, the grants that we've made and why we've made those as opposed to others. But I think it is the case, though, that as a researcher, I used to sort of stress on the need to prioritize industrial emissions better for all of these reasons, which as a grant maker, I don't think I've followed up on nearly as much as I should have.
So what's appealing about focusing on industrial emissions? I suppose one thing might be that you could reduce emissions a lot at relatively low cost to the industries, in as much as you're asking them to buy new equipment or properly use the scrubbing, the stuff that scrubs the exhaust from the factories and so on. And another, it's also quite potentially concentrated. So presumably, unlike household wood burning or household charcoal burning, we're talking about a much smaller number of actors here.
Yeah.
And there's also maybe an agency that is in principle kind of on your side, where you could go and speak to these bureaucrats and say, we want to get you the legislation that you need and the support that you need. There's a clear actor who you could ally with. Are there any other kind of benefits or challenges with this approach in particular?
No, I think those are all exactly right. Industrial emissions is one of those sources that are pretty well understood. You have sort of clear, good global best practices, the same scrubbers and cyclones and things like that, which folks would use in any part of the world would be applicable here. So the technology is well understood. You know what you're going to get at the end of that process. There are emission standards already. The pollution control boards already have the sort of legislative mandate to be able to tighten it in regions where which might be more polluted. So all of that exists, all of that foundation exists. I guess what was missing was that flexibility. Non-compliance to industrial emission standards was a criminal offense and so on, as sort of I talked about earlier. Recently, there was a legislative amendment that has sort of decriminalized non-compliance to these standards. It's one of those sort of windows of opportunity of trying to figure out, okay, what does it then mean for how a regulation could work differently than it has done in the last several decades. There is also better technology for monitoring, right? So one way of measuring the emissions from the chimney is that somebody actually physically climbs up a ladder. There is something called a porthole through which you collect a sample of the flue gas, take that to a laboratory and sort of measure how much, what the concentration of pollutants in there is and so forth. But you also now have continuous emissions monitoring systems that are basically able to measure these in real time, relay the data. So there have been those sort of technology improvements. Again, SEMS devices are installed, in most highly polluting industries already. The data coming out of several of them is kind of garbage, but it's something that you could sort of fix. Basically, these devices have to be calibrated better, have to be maintained well, but that's a solvable problem and solvable at like fairly low costs. So it's likely to be fairly cost-effective policy, and providing support to organizations that can help pollution control boards to do this are likely to be fairly cost-effective grants as well.
Can we talk for a minute about what is the politics, or what's the political economy of air pollution in northern India? I mean, you can imagine it's just a typical person like you might be really inclined to vote for a politician, perhaps, who says that they can reduce air pollution one way or another. But I guess a typical person doesn't know a ton about the issue or doesn't necessarily have a great sense of what policies would be most effective. I imagine you have some industrial actors who are not really keen to have the government increasing their costs or having continuous oversight of their pollutions. Maybe they would lobby against that. It sounded like there's subsistence farmers or small scale agriculture where maybe they don't particularly want outsiders coming in and telling them how they can engage in their farming. I guess especially as they're on very low income, so they can't necessarily afford the fancier equipment that would mean that they didn't need to do stubble burning anymore. Who are the key actors and the key interest groups here?
Right. So as you can imagine, and just from that list, right, there are multiple sources, which means there are sort of multiple sets of actors. At a high level, air pollution is still, unfortunately, like a fairly niche, elite kind of a concern, right? So that's still sufficient in many ways for example, for the judiciary to take notice, or for air pollution to even sort of make it to like the election manifestos in Delhi and elsewhere, right? Because sort of the elite advocacy groups are able to sort of at least have that level of heft to be able to push things along. I guess the challenge is that it's not more broad-based than that, and that's something that politicians are sort of well aware of. When it comes to, for example, the power plants, there is a very, very influential industrial lobby and sort of a ministry of power at the federal level that is, for example, it just has much more weight than the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So the Pollution Control Board and the Environment Ministry may sort of set whatever standards they want to. But if the coal power plants are not keen to sort of actually comply with that stuff, they can and they have persuaded the Power Ministry to sort of help them push back. Yeah, so some of these issues, for example, with the coal, it is sort of a hard problem, right? India is a developing country. Electricity demand will only grow. The governments do have sort of both sort of an incentive and possibly even an obligation to sort of provide reliable, affordable electricity. So that's sort of a hard one. With stubble burning, the farmers, not all of whom, by the way, are like subsistence level. Some of them are reasonably well off and should be able to afford. It's just that I guess nobody wants to pay.
They don't want to.
Yeah, exactly. So nobody wants to pay costs that they don't have to. They know that they could potentially get away with it. So for the most part, policy has actually been trying to sort of subsidize this equipment and sort of provide carrots as opposed to like taking more punitive action, because they just are sort of an influential group more generally. An alternative way in which sort of the political economy concern sort of manifests itself is that even if the political parties want to be seen as progressive on air pollution and be seen as folks who are sort of taking this seriously, you have an incentive to try and do the kinds of stuff that are sort of more visible in the near term than stuff that are necessarily useful. So that in many ways creates the incentive for at least the mechanical street sweepers, which may have plausible impact, and at its extreme, like, invest in the outdoor air purifiers that have no impact but are, like visible manifestations of intent. There's a bunch of political economy literature that sort of looks at the Indian state and what it can and cannot deliver well, right? So one of the conclusions there has been that when it comes to sort of routine delivery of public services, right, which in many ways are sort of less legible, less visible, there isn't a strong enough incentive to make some of the larger systemic changes and reforms there, right? So the Indian state is much better at one-time, potentially even like complex things. So, for example, getting the entire country or a large fraction of the country vaccinated for COVID might be the kind of thing that the Indian state can actually pull off reasonably well, right? Or like run elections, for a country this large in like a smooth, sort of streamlined way. Like that's the kind of stuff that the Indian state can pull off quite well. But you have your best officers taking charge of that. So there are ways in which one-time things with like an exit, in a sense, those are easier to do. Improving waste management, making the roads better, not have potholes and things like that, better designed and better maintained. That's the kind of stuff that's sort of harder to do. Yeah. But that may also provide an entry into solving air pollution.
I would have thought that it was a big quality of life issue in Delhi and other places, that this would be a higher level issue for voters. And it sounds like it's not in the top 5 issues. Is there an explanation for that?
I mean, partly it is that air pollution, if it's not at those apocalyptic levels, like we have in November, is largely an invisible thing, right?
Or you just get used to it. This is just the way things always are. Or no, it's just, you're saying it doesn't even smell that bad necessarily.
Exactly. So it doesn't smell that bad necessarily. Unless you sort of buy into this literature and you're poring over the global burden of disease or something like that, right? The impacts are really over a large period of time. So folks might be dying of sort of lung cancer, or might be, sort of getting diabetes more, or getting these sort of chronic lung diseases and so forth. But it's not easy to attribute to air pollution. So that's the challenge, and it's sort of hard to make it more visible and salient to people in their daily lives.
So in prepping for this, I made a list of possible barriers to reducing air pollution in India, and I broke it down into people not paying attention or appreciating that the issue matters much. Then there's kind of incompetence and opting for solutions that are daft and don't really make much difference. Then there's political power of polluters, meaning that it's hard to get up sensible solutions that would interfere with their interests. And then there's it just being too expensive for India, for a country at India's level of wealth and development to pay for the solutions. And then there was a fifth one, which is we're mistaken, and actually some of these things shouldn't be done because the costs would exceed the benefits. It sounds that at least the first all four of them are quite significant factors, that there's not that much attention. When attention is turned to it, dumb stuff gets done reasonably often. Polluters have a lot of potential to block changes. And also some of the things that we might like to do are kind of just too expensive right now, like getting lots of people to switch to LNG for house fuel.
I agree. All those 4 are true. I'm somewhat more charitable in my read on sort of the incompetence angle. Sure, I mean, that's probably there. But in many ways, I think one of the limitations from the side of civil society and think tanks and so on has been not providing those solutions in a manner that's sort of sufficiently sympathetic of sort of the incentives and constraints that these decision makers face, and therefore sort of the slightly more nuanced lobbying or advocacy or whatever you'd like to call it. I think that's something that's sort of been missing. Part of it is that there's some legitimate knowledge gaps, but so I don't think the incompetence is necessarily solely on the side of the government here.
Just on that last one, that maybe something shouldn't get done. Of course, as a country gets richer, often air pollution goes up, but also people get more reliable access to electricity. They, have better access to transport. Just GDP goes up and health improves in other ways for all these reasons. Is it possible that some things that you and I might be inclined to push for, or at least I might be inclined to push for, would in fact on net be bad because they would have too damaging an economic impact? And there's lots of pollution that presumably we think should happen. If we tried to reduce air pollution 80% overnight, it would actually be a catastrophe because all sorts of really important stuff would have to stop. Yeah, what's the risk of kind of things backfiring?
I think the key is the speed of this. So if you actually wanted most of these changes to happen very soon, you are then necessarily restricting yourself to a set of fairly coercive, borderline draconian, if not draconian actions, which might end up being fairly harmful. So a case in point is that because construction dust is a significant share of Delhi's air pollution, one of the things that happens every winter is there's something called a graded response action plan. So basically a set of escalating actions in response to escalating levels of air pollution, some of which are preemptive in nature. And so construction activities are basically banned in Delhi for a month. Maybe more, and some of it is unpredictable. So it's not like folks can plan actively around it and say from the 1st of December to the 15th of December, there won't be construction, right? So these are usually bans that are announced a few days in advance or something, which can therefore be extremely expensive for the folks developing these projects, has significant income loss for the laborers that work on these sites. So yeah, I think the key is the speed at which you want. So if you're looking for abrupt drastic changes in air quality, that will likely end up being expensive. However, I'm reasonably persuaded that for the most part, and certainly like at an average or sort of net level, the benefits are going to far exceed the costs. And if sort of this emergent literature on productivity and so on is true, right? And they may well be, these costs might be sort of, the benefits rather, in terms of improved productivity and improved cognition, might be on par, if not even maybe larger than the health impacts, then the case is sort of pretty solid that cleaning your air will also sort of boost economic growth.
Yeah, that's one reason I think economists have been getting more and more incensed by this issue, is that they think that so many of the ways that we might reduce air pollution would, from a country level or an economic point of view, pay for themselves many fold over. Because having people be sick is very bad for well-being and extremely expensive to deal with. And then it means people can't go to work. And then if this other stuff that having air pollution reduces worker productivity, makes people unable to work intelligently. If that stuff's true, then these effects could be really enormous. Mm-hmm. And so we might be willing to pay really quite surprising amounts, much more than we currently feel like we should be willing to pay in order to reduce air pollution. And what's going on is simply that the benefits are not so visible. We can't connect all of the benefits that we're getting from reducing air pollution to the while the costs are extremely obvious and immediately visible to governments and people having to buy new equipment and so on.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, let's look at this from another angle now. So we've kind of been talking about like what object level, what like on the ground changes to equipment and methods and transport and so on might be cost effective. But you have to look at things from a like somewhat more meta level, where you're saying like whatever we're ultimately trying to have happen, you have to think about grants that would cause the government in almost all cases to implement these changes or cause other actors to change their behavior. And I guess the dream is that you could get a lot of leverage there, where relatively small grants might be able to shift policy across an entire state or a city or conceivably even the entire country if you really changed what people believed and what was politically feasible. Mm-hmm. So yeah, do you have any indications about how practical it is to drive policy change as a philanthropist, basically, or even just as any kind of private actor in this space in India?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm definitely fairly bullish about sort of the possibility of progress through the work that individual researchers and think tanks and policy advocacy groups can do. Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain areas where the possibilities of leverage are pretty high, and therefore small grants can have sort of outsized impact. One constraint as a grant maker here is sort of because I represent an international foundation, and sort of the foreign funding rules in India are fairly restrictive, and this is especially the case when it comes to sort of environmental work, which I think has often been interpreted as being adversarial when it comes to sort of industrial and economic development in India, right? So that does restrict the types of grants that one could make, right? So, for example, we talked about how the judiciary has had a huge influence. I am fairly ambivalent about sort of the overall the impact that the courts have had. I mean, I do think that some good things have happened as a result of it, but I also think that they're not necessarily the places where this decision making should be done. But either way, that seems like a potentially important institution to be able to influence or work with, right? But as a grant maker, like that's something that I can't touch.
I see.
Or at least have chosen not to touch. I mean, I think there are, sort of following the letter of the law, there's certain things that you can and cannot do, but there's also the spirit of the thing, and we have been fairly sort of careful. Media is sort of another sort of important sort of agent of change. Arguably, one of the things that ended up leading to sort of this increased pace of activity over, since maybe 2015, 2016 was that media outlets took notice, and there were just a lot more stories. And over a period of time, these stories became more and more sophisticated in sort of their understanding of the signs of air pollution and, what governments ought to be doing and not doing and things like that. So that had an important role. Again, that's something that as an international foundation, we can't make direct grants to.
Oh, really? It's just not permitted to do anything regarding.
It's not permitted. You cannot you cannot fund journalists to sort of write stories, because it could be interpreted that this is basically like a foreign actor trying to influence sort of the media discourse, and therefore the general narratives within a country. So some of those are the types of things that could plausibly lead to changes and have very high leverage, but stuff that we can't and should not do.
It's off the table, unfortunately.
They're off the table. As an Indian citizen, I understand where this comes from. Some of it,
yeah, of course,
seems to me as sort of being potentially defensive, but this really sort of feels above my pay grade, and I think it's entirely reasonable to sort of be compliant with the spirit of some of these restrictions, even if that means that you do have some opportunities off the table. I wish there was sort of more domestic funding in India that was sort of trying to go behind these opportunities and be engaged in equality. That unfortunately has not been enough of the case. I mean, it's a fairly neglected area even from a domestic funding standpoint. So we've had to therefore restrict ourselves to certain types of grant-making opportunities. But I do think that there is still plenty of highly cost-effective opportunities on the table.
Yeah. So what sort of options are you most excited about that you can engage in?
I guess one way to sort of classify the types of grants that we could make here is so one is that there is a policy framework in place. There is therefore an opportunity to like fund organizations that can work with government in providing technical assistance, project management assistance, and sort of governance support of various sort of hues and shades. So that's something that has sort of been the largest chunk of our grant making so far, and they sort of fall along a continuum. So some of them you can think of as effectively consultants sitting within government, essentially being responsive to priorities that their partners within government sort of express, and just sort of helping them think through these, help them implement some of these things or monitor some of these things like that. So effectively, we are therefore paying for consultants who would sort of be sitting within government, helping with whatever the government agencies are interested in. Further along that continuum are organizations that are essentially have their own strong core areas of expertise, which might be restricted to one or two sources of air pollution, folks who specialize in transport or on industries or whatever, and are essentially pitching potential intervention ideas to government or building capacity within these organizations to be able to intervene better. So providing technical support, but from like the standpoint of having expertise in these areas. So there are a few grants of that kind. We have a grant, for example, to the World Bank, right? Which in some sense is providing technical assistance, but the World Bank also brings the prospect of potential loans, right, to the table. So there's a higher leverage that one could potentially have here, that not only are these folks trying to recommend certain types of interventions and get budgets allocated within government for that, but also help the government raise resources at the state level, for example, to do this. So that's one kind of technical support or governance support grant that we've also tried. Something to note here is that it's not obvious to me how many of these are going to work, right? So from sort of from a hit-based giving standpoint, it's not obvious what good governance support would look like here, and which organizations are going to be particularly well placed to like actually pull off the stuff that they claim they will. So, I mean, I'm new as a grant maker. This is my sort of second year of doing this, and so there's it's been a little bit of a learning curve as well to sort of try and figure out. I mean, we'll take our chances with a few promising organizations, but we can't be sure what success will look like in any of these cases.
Yeah, hit-based giving is this philosophy where you say, well, I'm going to accept that maybe 9 out of 10 of the grants that I make are not really going to go anywhere, but 1 in 10 will be a massive success. It'll be a big hit, and that will pay for the rest. A little bit like a venture capitalist style of investment. And I think whenever you're trying to influence government policy, I think you basically have to engage in hit-based giving with that in mind, because there's no simple, reliable thing that allows you to slightly improve government policy by an equal amount for every $1,000 that you spend. You can't just crank the handle.
Low probabilities of success, but then if it comes off, it can potentially have outsized impact.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so it sounds like you're trying to cultivate experts and consultants and think tanks that can work either almost directly within government bureaucracies or can be consulted by government bureaucracies when they want and provide expert advice and have kind of a policy menu on the that they've thought about and developed and they've tried to answer many of the questions that we've been talking about earlier, like what changes would be most cost effective, how would you change the legislation in order to make this work well. But we're at the stage where that groundwork, you're saying, kind of hasn't been done to a surprising extent. There's just a lot of questions that, it'd be great if academics or think tanks were looking into, that then this would be really useful for people in government or legislators who wanted to take action on this at some point. Is that's the basic picture?
That's right. I mean, I wouldn't say that this hasn't been done at all. I mean, it has been done in other sort of spheres of governance, not as much on sort of air quality type things. Another that they have been done by other foundations, but perhaps not at sort of the scale and maybe level of risk taking that, for example, maybe Open Philanthropy is sort of more comfortable with. So I think that's something that we've tried to bring to the table here.
Yeah, I know one reason that Open Philanthropy decided to go into this area is that they thought it was surprisingly neglected, like relative to the very large number of deaths that's being incurred. I think, would it be like 1 or 2 million people dying in India every year due to air pollution? Mm-hmm. There was surprisingly few people focused on it. Is there a way of kind of quantifying or explaining how neglected the topic of air pollution in South Asia is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way to think about it is like the amount of funding that has gone into it, right? So one of the more careful analyses of like the funding landscape basically came to the conclusion that I'd like to say in 2020, there was something like 7 million a year going into all things air quality in India.
Is that from outside the country or including, philanthropy inside the country or advocacy inside the country?
Well, I think primarily from outside the country, but then from within the country, there was very little. And that's still the case. So I don't think that would really change the estimate very much.
It's extraordinarily low. It's almost hard to believe that it can be that low, that one feels that something has to be getting missed here.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, right? And even that, I think in like maybe the last couple of years, that might potentially be shrinking a little bit because a significant chunk, outside Open Phil, several of the foundations that were funding air quality work in India were primarily coming at it from a climate standpoint. And since Paris, since the COP, actually not just Paris, maybe even just a couple of years back, folks have now pivoted back towards things like electric vehicles and just transitions and so on. And in some ways, the funding for air quality has shrunk a little bit compared to those numbers. So I think that gives you a sense of how neglected it is compared to like the scale of the problem. One reason could be, I think there's a legitimate question of tractability here, which is, are there enough organizations that would sort of be able to absorb the funding? Actually, even as Open Phil entered this area, that was sort of an uncertainty that sort of was still there. In many ways, I think that uncertainty exists even now. We're not sure how much folks would be able to absorb funding to utilize in a cost-effective manner.
What's the impediment to absorbing funding? Is it just that there are not really obvious places that you could send the money to that can scale and do much with it? There aren't people who want to enter this area, or?
Yeah, there aren't enough number of organizations with a scale in terms of like their own staffing or the experience or expertise they have in-house to be able to absorb grants of even like a few $100,000. So I think that's probably still a bit of a challenge. And not just absorb, right, but also like do useful things with it.
Yeah.
So it's given, I guess, compared to like the neighborhood, compared to Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, there are more organizations. The field is, to my estimation, like maybe 5 to 10 years ahead of where the other countries are. But still, there just aren't enough organizations covering enough cities, enough states in India with a reasonable depth or breadth of experience in different sectors.
I guess so that would leave you in a kind of field building stage, potentially, where you'd say, we can't just fund an existing infrastructure here. We can't like find all of these existing experts who could make use of millions of dollars. Instead, we have to gradually train these people and, create programs at universities to create new experts who then in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time will actually be able to make use of substantially more funding. So it would kind of be a talent bottleneck situation where there just aren't enough people qualified to take senior roles in the area.
That's exactly right. This is especially true of, I guess, policy work and think tanks and advocacy groups. One low-hanging fruit, one set of opportunities that sort of were on the table and were sort of neglected from a funding standpoint was that if you were to buy into the premise that there are substantial knowledge gaps that have impeded action, right, and that better and more applied academic research could sort of fill those gaps substantially. You do, in fact, have many academic groups in the country that can actually absorb funds, sort of for their research projects, improving monitoring, improving our understanding of sources, and so forth. Yeah. So that has actually been a second significant sort of sub-strategy for the program.
I see. Okay, so this approach would be, I guess, trying to set up lots of monitors to notice where air pollution is higher than people think. And I guess conceivably, could you try to find some way of finding out which factories are producing far more pollution than they ought to be without necessarily having to visit them? Yeah, is that the kind of picture?
That's the kind of thing. And are there sources that we have basically completely missed so far that actually play important roles, at a larger regional level or perhaps even in like specific cities? Yeah, things like that. With monitoring, I guess that there are two ways of thinking about it, right? So one is like actually directly filling that gap and providing visibility into, for example, what rural air pollution looks like, but then also potentially setting the stage for government to be sort of deploying low-cost sensors on their own at like a larger scale, right? But because that's not something that they have done so far, being able to like pilot the use of, these monitoring technologies that are sort of new and offer new advantages and so forth at a scale that is sufficient to then inform the use of these approaches by government in the future.
Can you basically fund the creation of a think tank / advocacy group that would push for like the air quality boards to be able to just impose fines on anyone who violates the legislative, pollution thresholds? That's something that jumped out to me as kind of a very natural thing that you might do.
I guess some of the governance support grants, would effectively be, potential opportunities to do things like that, right? So At the moment, most of our grants are sort of somewhat broad and sort of source agnostic in scope, in the sense they sort of follow from like the priorities that the government partners they're working with have sort of expressed to them. And therefore, in some instances, they're in fact working on industries. But this is exactly the kind of opportunity I think that we have not explored enough of, where you might end up having a lot of leverage that. Yeah.
Could you describe in a little bit more detail, like what are some of the grants that you've made since you started, or some of the grants that you're looking at and considering making now?
Sure. So the very first grant that I made was in fact, to a university professor, an academic group, to basically set up a very large low-cost sensor network across rural Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Right? I mean, two of the most populous states in India. Uttar Pradesh is the largest state. And like I said, rural air pollution was completely neglected. So what this project entails is basically setting up something like 1,400 monitors across these two states by sort of a fairly prominent academic who's seen as sort of a credible, trusted expert by these governments. And, in general has done excellent work on sort of the use of low-cost sensors and so forth. Get him to basically spearhead this effort at like covering these two states. In some ways, helping improve the measurement of rural air pollution, but also like almost testing the use of sensors for a use case like this, right? Because the low-cost sensors have many strengths and have many advantages that they can offer. But if they're not sort of calibrated well and maintained well and so forth, they'll basically spit out not very reliable data, right? So not just sort of deploying sensors, but like setting up like the processes where you can be confident about the numbers that these are reporting involves a bunch of uncertainties at the moment. So that's what, in many ways, we have taken a bet on this academic to try and solve. And if he's able to sort of demonstrate to these state governments that, look, you can actually do this well, and it costs a tiny fraction of what like the more traditional monitors do, and therefore there is a way in which you could use your own resources better to have hybrid monitoring networks, I think that could be a great win. If he's able to persuade them that rural air pollution is a large and real problem and that you should be making much more progress, that'll be a huge win.
I see. Okay, so the situation is that up until now, governments have mostly relied on quite expensive centralized monitors that are, I guess, they're more accurate, but they're much more expensive. And so here you want to trial and demonstrate that something that's much lower cost that you could scale up to many thousands, tens of thousands, even across the country. That although that you can overcome the accuracy issues, and that could potentially cause people to realize, oh wow, we should be monitoring this, and we can monitor it at acceptable cost at a much larger scale. And then that could that could have a whole lot of effects, but it could make the whole issue much more salient and people much more able to complain that air pollution in their area is unacceptable.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any other grants that you could describe?
So, I briefly outlined the various governance support type grants. So I can give a couple of examples to give some concreteness to it. The World Bank grant, for example, what they'll basically be doing is a bunch of technical assistance. So they work with different state governments to try and persuade them on how they could approach planning and sort of state level prioritization of different actions. One of the things that the World Bank, I think, has been doing pretty effectively in India is sort of making the case for moving beyond sort of city-specific or city-centric governance to working at the airshed level. Now, an airshed is sort of, I guess, an intuitive enough concept to sort of acknowledge, saying, okay, well, look, air pollution does not really recognize administrative boundaries, that these pollutants can actually travel tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers, and therefore you want to be operating at the scale at which these pollutants seem to move and get created and so forth, right? But in practical terms, what this means is that you would need to be able to work with neighboring states, have almost a common plan of action, in many ways hold your neighboring states to account. If you were to actually truly recognize this as a South Asia-wide thing, it means that there is cooperation between Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and Nepal in trying to solve air pollution. I guess, to put it mildly, Pakistan and India don't really see eye to eye a whole lot.
Yeah.
So I guess figuring out how to operationalize this concept and persuading, I guess, starting at the state level, right? Just sort of that itself is actually a fairly large transition, right? In terms of how governance is being done for air pollution. Being able to sort of think of this as not an urban problem anymore, but as something which, where you have a common plan for rural sources and industrial sources and urban sources. So that's something that they're doing. They're also trying to, I think, bring in ways that are perhaps unique to a multilateral agency like the bank, trying to institutionalize cost effectiveness analysis for this prioritization, which I'm pretty excited about. I think there hasn't been enough systematic sort of conversation, systematic attempts even at cost benefit analysis in prioritizing different actions. So that's something that we are sort of taking a bet on the World Bank for. They've been doing good work, and we also thought of this as a nice learning opportunity for us in terms of figuring out, ways of intervening and trying to influence decision making and helping sort of move towards the next generation of air quality governance.
Yeah, I should have asked this earlier, but the air quality boards, or the air control boards, they're at the city level primarily. Is that right? So this tends to be governed at a fairly local level rather than at the state or let alone national level.
So, given the variety of sources that we have, there are actually multiple agencies at the federal or central, as we put it in India, level, the state levels, and at the levels of sort of local government. So it really depends on the source. The state pollution control boards are in many ways the principal regulators, environmental regulators in the country. There is a central pollution control board, which basically acts as, on the one hand, an expert institution that sort of sets certain standards that the state pollution control boards then sort of follow. But they also have some sort of direct regulatory responsibilities. But for the most part, it's the states, right? However, they are primarily focused on industrial sources of pollution. When it comes to other sources, for example, with transport, where you really have like a much wider variety of possible actions. There is a state transport department. There is the municipal corporation. There's a traffic police, which in many ways acts as sort of the principal on-road regulator for like visibly polluting vehicles and so on. So yeah, you basically need coordinated action across all these different agencies to be able to do anything. Anything on waste is with the local government. Anything on power plants, to some extent, it's at the state level, but primarily it's at the federal level that you have. So depending on the source, the agency and sort of the scale of governance is quite different.
Yeah. Okay, let's maybe do a third grant or a third approach that you've been interested to look into.
All right. So this is, I think, one where there has been sort of the most skepticism internally within the organization, while I am extremely excited about it. So it's super cruxy in that sense. So I made a grant to this sort of consortium of primarily sort of academic partners to develop something called a reduced complexity model, right? So let me try and explain what this is and why I'm sort of excited about it. One of the challenges with sort of policy analysis on figuring out what kinds of interventions will work well and so on is that translating a particular action to sort of the delta in emissions from that particular source is relatively straightforward, right? But going further and saying that this action, which will have this delta of emissions from this source, will result in this improvement in concentrations, right? Which is what we care about most, is significantly harder to do because depending on the source, that the pollutants may disperse to like various scales. They may react with various other substances in the atmosphere. So capturing this dynamic requires a very specific form of expertise that allows you to model dispersion on the one hand, but also atmospheric chemistry. So it requires a specific kind of expertise. It requires enormous computing power and time. So if you're basically consider, for example, coal power plants, right? So you're looking at potential alternative policy interventions that you could take. So there is a particular kind of emissions control technology that is going to get mandated. Alternatively, you're saying that you're going to tighten the standards by X%, and everybody has to comply with it in whatever way they want. Alternatively, you're saying these power plants have to be shut down, right? Now, trying to figure out what impact each of these alternative scenarios would have on like air quality levels actually becomes pretty sort of complicated from like a scientific standpoint, right? And that has meant that the folks who do policy analysis are folks who also have the ability to like make, sort of do the scenario modeling and so forth. Now, I'd submit that the vast number of people who have the atmospheric chemistry expertise don't really have any kind of expertise on like understanding policy.
I see, right.
And then the folks who can do like the policy stuff and like understand the nuances of how these things cost and have no ability to like do the atmospheric chemistry stuff, which creates a gap in like the policy analysis that gets produced, which creates this particular gap that we have in like not having any cost benefit analysis or not nearly enough cost benefit analysis of different policy actions. What the reduced complexity models will do, coming back to the grant, is basically simplifying that sort of second step of the process, right? So essentially they make some approximations on like the atmospheric chemistry side, but basically provide this very nifty computationally light tool that you can learn. So folks who don't have the atmospheric chemistry training and so on can just use the tool, generate the scenarios they want, be able to figure out what impact it will have at like a fraction of the costs, a tiny fraction of the time involved. And that potentially helps create the foundation for like new quantitative policy analysis on alternative interventions, right? Which makes me like super excited about the grant.
Yeah.
But I can talk about the case against it.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so in a nutshell, this would allow someone who's, say, an expert on transportation or on, house fuel burning, who's not a climate scientist, to actually, at a reasonably accurate level, a tolerably accurate level, model what implications this would have across the airshed if policy and emissions, or like pollution emissions, were changed in this way or that. And I guess, and this would allow them to say a whole lot more and potentially to communicate to politicians and the public like what benefits they might expect to see if they changed policy in some direction. Seems pretty good. What's the case against it?
So the case against it is that, this is field building from like an even earlier stage than with like some of the other work, right? On the governance support type stuff. In some sense, we are creating or trying to create the supply of policy analysis, assuming that there is either a latent demand or that a demand will get created once this stuff is out there and is seen as credible and interesting or insightful, which is a non-trivial assumption.
Yeah.
I think you could justifiably say, look, we are starting at a fairly low base. There are probably a bunch of actions that you could do without any of this very particular kind of policy analysis. And given the way politics works and given the way sort of policies get decided and implemented and so forth, there is enough sort of messiness in there that this kind of thing might not actually add a tremendous amount of value. And you might end up doing the same stuff. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate point.
Yeah. Why do you support it anyway?
Why I support it is that if you look at air quality governance in other countries, right? So the way the US EPA works, the way something called the CLRTAP, which is the Convention of Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution, which was basically this surprisingly successful international convention, which involved, when it was signed, the Soviet Union, the US, Canada, and most of the European countries in trying to solve acid rain initially, and then actually go ahead and try and tackle other types of air pollution. The way these things functioned, had analysis of this kind almost at its core. So there was sort of diplomatic engagement and compromises and reconciliation, all of that happening with the CLR TAP. But in many ways, the policy analysis and scientific assessments sort of provided the facts, if you will, of that sort of informed the contours of those negotiations, right? Likewise, with the US EPA, I'm sure there are a ton of political negotiations, but the cost-benefit analysis is almost by default. When states draw up their implementation plans, they running some of these models that look at alternative policy scenarios and so on. That happens as process, right? So there is good reason to believe that this adds value, helps, sort of becomes the foundation of evidence-based sort of governance and policy making of a particular kind that has basically been standard and has worked in other parts of the world. And therefore, there is going to be some point, probably very soon, if you've not already reached there, where the common sense based sort of prioritization of different actions and so on will sort of hit its limit. And where you actually ought to be taking the support of more careful, thoughtful analysis, right? Yeah. Which would be impossible right now, and which potentially the reduced complexity models can help solve. Partly it's also addressing the constraint in terms of talent in India for running these more complicated atmospheric chemistry models across the country.
You need to make it easier.
Yeah. A few groups can do it, but that's not enough given the scale of the problem.
Yeah. Okay, so it's been... There's a historical example where it seems like something like this was extremely instrumental in getting up one of the most successful international environmental treaties ever. So that makes you think that maybe it could be useful in this case as well, which makes a lot of sense. I guess speaking of historical analogs, are there examples of other cities or countries that have managed to greatly reduce their air pollution and improve health significantly, starting from something like the situation that India is in now? Are there other case studies that you can learn from?
There are. In fact, one of the reasons that I remain optimistic that this is a solvable problem is simply that it has been solved elsewhere. And in many ways, starting from a lower base of knowledge. So starting from the Great Smog in London in 1952, where over the course of like a few days, the updated estimate suggests that something like 12,000 people died as a direct consequence of that smog, right? To legislation a few years later, and then to sort of control measures in terms of cleaner coal for residential use, coal power plants having emission controls or being shut down entirely. So that has meant that London has made sort of tremendous progress, right? Across the US, just actually even using a sort of more recent timeline, the US EPA claims that from 2000 to 2022, across the United States, there has been something like a 41% reduction in PM 2.5 due to the various types of actions that taken. In China, which I guess is sort of, in some ways, is most comparable in terms of just the population and the scale of the pollution. Although I think even at its peak, Beijing, for example, was never as polluted as Delhi is. Right? I mean, sure, there might be like episodic highs, but in terms of like...
On average,
the pollution was always lower than Delhi is. But across China, there seems to have been like a 30% reduction from about 2010 to 2019, 2020, primarily because of better industrial emissions control, transitions of the fuel used in many of these industries from coal to gas, something that, for example, is happening in parts of India right now. Basically, almost internalizing sort of some of the state capacity constraints and say, okay, look, there are probably more economically efficient ways of like getting these industries to emit less, but it's unlikely that the state capacity, given the state capacity constraints, that the pollution control boards can actually sort of pull that off. So there could be like a more command and control type mandate on like fuel conversion from solid fuels to a much cleaner gas. So that's one thing that China did. Again, improving the quality of residential fuels for heating from coal to gas. I think that's something that really worked well, which I think has a quite direct sort of analog in India as well. So there are things to learn from other countries. Arguably, the state capacity thing is one big constraint. The variety of sources is makes it more challenging in India, but I think there is plenty to learn from elsewhere.
Yeah. So I guess the difference with China is maybe in 2010, China was several times richer in terms of GDP per capita than India is now. So maybe there were options that were financially viable for them that India might struggle to pay for now. I guess, what does state capacity mean exactly? I mean, there's lots of governance issues in China, but I suppose, do we just think that the bureaucracy in China is just more able to do things? It's more able to deliver services. It's more able to tell businesses what to do. Can we be more concrete about what is the difference between the government in India and the government in China?
I can't claim to be an expert on like governance in China. So I think that limits. So some of these are sort of maybe high level superficial takes.
Yeah.
Partly, I think China has been able to resolve some of like the political economy based challenges for like industries, right? So I think there are ways in which if the pollution control boards and were to get like the political backing they need to tell industries, look, you got to clean up your act and be able to like comply with like the standards you got, or potentially even these more stringent standards. It need not necessarily be economically prohibitively expensive for the industries to do so, but because they don't have that political backing, because even from within government, the pollution control boards are seen as sort of a hindrance to industrial development. In many ways, they have been trying to signal success by how much they can cut red tape, right? And sort of make it easier for industries to function than how much they're able to clean up the air or water.
I see, right.
Right. And so, I think changing those incentives, changing the sort of the success metrics could play a huge role. I think China was able to, once there was enough of a public demand that seemed to have built up for sort of cleaner air, they were able to sort of take some of these tougher actions, which has been harder to do in India. On the state capacity thing, I can be, in terms of like the routine service delivery, my prior would be that some of these issues, the bureaucracy is able to like implement stuff better, like, implement a better waste management infrastructure, sort of better or something like that. I have no basis to believe that, though.
Okay.
So I won't belabor.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, we've been recording for quite a while, and I should let you go get to your kid there and eventually get to sleep as well, because it's getting somewhat late over there in India. Maybe it's kind of a final sort of questions. If there's someone, we have a non-trivial number of listeners in India actually. What sorts of things could someone potentially do if they were a smart undergraduate in India? What kinds of things could they study, or what career might they pursue if they wanted to help with this, with the air pollution issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way of trying to solve for like the absence of successful, scalable interventions and so on is there just being a lot more pilots out there, and a lot more organizations that are able to focus on a particular source of pollution and like test out new technology, test out new methods of, I don't know, monitoring and enforcement or something. I think there is like a significant demand out there, even from within government, right? So from my conversations with bureaucrats, they're like, look, everybody who wants to work with us wants to like set up monitors, wants to sort of help define the problem better. We think that's helpful, no doubt. But in many ways, we get it, right? We know that there is a significant air pollution problem. We know that, give or take, this is what the most important sources are, and this is how much they. So if you had to go beyond like the problem defining stuff and like actually figure out what you can do about it and test out new methods, test out new tech, and like the governance support grants at the moment, right? I mean, are really trying to sort of try and make the existing processes more efficient, or they're not necessarily bringing new ideas to the table. Having folks, more folks who could, sort of help in like the actual problem solving as opposed to the problem defining, I think there's a big gap. And I think that would be, I think it'd be great if there's sort of a larger number of young folks trying out new things, not assuming constraints that may not exist actually in practice. Yeah, just trying out stuff, like doing things. I think that'd be great. There's clearly an appetite for it.
And is Open Phil potentially going to be hiring for more people to work on the South Asia Air Quality Program? It seems like it's such a huge space that you need quite a large team in order to be able to fully understand all of the different options.
We might in the future. So I think everything turns on sort of the experience of the first couple of years of grant making and what we learn from it. So there is, I think, a real possibility that we actually update negatively in terms of like the tractability, right? That sure, it's an important problem. Sure, it's neglected, but actually being able to make progress requires organizations that don't exist or ideas that just haven't yet, that aren't already out there. And so that might be like a negative update. I don't know if that's the case, but yes, things do turn on that. If our grant making were to increase in the other countries, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, there could potentially be, depending on sort of scale of it, there might be the need for folks who understand those countries better, who understand what works. And yeah, because I for all intents and purposes, I'm quite the generalist when it comes to. I have no idea how policy making in Pakistan functions, and so I think if that becomes a larger part of the portfolio, and there are more opportunities out there. Again, I think tractability has been the big constraint in the other countries. There just don't seem to be enough organizations that work on air pollution.
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult chicken and egg problem where there hasn't been funding available, so people haven't got into it. But that means that there's currently not really people who you could fund. Makes it
That's right.
Maybe it makes it hard to scale things up super quickly in any area. It's also been a kind of classic issue in AI and artificial intelligence policy, AI technical stuff as well. Cool. Well, I remember I spoke with Alexander Berger 3 years ago, I think, when they were considering going into South Asia air quality, and everyone was super excited about this possible new program area. But they weren't sure whether they would find someone who was able to actually take the bull by the horns and take forward the program. So I'm super glad that they did manage to find you, and you've got so much to say and so much knowledge about this. There was always a risk that this program wouldn't even start because the field just wouldn't have been built yet. So yeah, thanks for all of the work that you're doing. It sounds super exciting as well as being kind of challenging.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. I guess the jury is still out there on sort of how I'll actually perform as a grant maker. It's still sort of early days, and it's been a fantastic learning experience. I mean, and Open Phil, I think, has been a really good organization to be a grant maker in and sort of learn the ropes and stuff. So it's been wonderful. And I enjoyed our chat today, and I hope it was coherent enough and focused enough.
Yeah, definitely. more than coherent enough. Yeah, well, we'll all be rooting for you. Maybe we can check in a couple of years' time and see how some of these grants have gone and which direction the research has ended up moving.
Yeah, I'd love that.
My guest today has been Santosh Harish. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Santosh.
Thanks, Rob.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you'll be glad to know that I have an interview with the founder of the Lead Exposure Elimination Project coming up sometime soon, which covers many more issues related to dangerous pollution in developing and sometimes developed countries. And if you liked that episode, you could show your appreciation by telling a friend about this show or forwarding it to someone out there who might really enjoy listening to it, or someone who might enjoy listening to some other previous episode of the show that you have particularly enjoyed. You really are able to get the show into the hands of people who would value it and might be able to usefully act on what they learn in a way that is really hard for us to do because, we only personally know so many people. All right. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris. The audio engineering team is led by Ben Cordell, with mastering and technical editing by Milo Maguire and Simon Mansour. Additional content editing by Louisa Rodriguez and Katie Moore, who also puts together full transcripts and extensive collection of links to learn more, available on our site, as always, 80,000hours.org. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.